We got Randolph. We got.
I'm all yours.
So Bruce.
In front of the camera with that shirt.
I think the San Juan superintendent said he
What
gonna
was
watch
that, Todd?
With that shirt, you gotta go in front of the camera. So you can, the glow will shine through.
Going in front of
I thought you were gonna
camera.
watch online.
Hi, Dale.
How we
Is
doing?
that the next meeting? Don't you have a board meeting tonight?
Hi, Natalie.
You still made it? In the snow? Nice.
They make them tough down in San Juan.
Why would anyone be sleeping at 5 in the morning anyway?
Crazy people. Miles beef. Bruce.
You applied.
Well, you know, I applied when Amber applied. Did you know that?
Yeah.
I was the other finalist. And
Oh, there's
And then
Bruce.
you chose better.
I don't know about that. How that could be living in. Bruce, don't sit by me. It's okay.
Oh, I was just gonna go over here by, like,
Does anyone know if Terry
Is that the
Shoemaker was
BA
gonna come
side?
today?
I guess so.
Oh,
Oh,
right
like, that doesn't work.
I'm just kidding.
I wasn't afraid. I was going to
You
just
better
sit
move.
right by
Sorry.
Natalie.
It's alright, I know no one else is sitting with me. It's fine.
Sure, I didn't want to. How are you?
Scott's coming. He'll be late though.
We have a superintendent.
Island.
Hi, Bruce. Glad you're here.
Oh, hi, how are you?
Hey, do you know, are they, the arms were up going on the way out. Do you need to get them?
No, I think we've left the arms up for
Very listening.
the week. I'm not sure why. Yeah.
They were down.
They were
The
down.
park couldn't get in the park.
Go out, do you need it validated is what I'm
Yeah.
saying?
Making judgments. Very-
Well, if they're up, you can just drive out. If they're down, you have to get them validated. But the front desk, there's a machine up there. So you should
Outliers over here.
Was it down, Bruce? You couldn't get
No,
it?
I think the going
It's
out.
really nice.
It was down.
I like that pink.
It's like
I was wearing pink last
it's like
night.
a weight problem or something. Like if you go through it too fast, it doesn't know you've gone through it. So it stays up. Not that I've raced it, but
Ron, how are you?
down.
so you had to take a good guess.
There's no
I was
park.
in that Innovations West Forum in San Diego, so.
Survived board meetings, so it's all good.
Yeah, I did last night.
Okay, well, should we get going?
This office is influential. Reconfiguring my
See,
Zero. Password for the.
No, if you do guess, it's just.
Yes,
It's open.
yeah, gas is open. Gas is open.
And then they take your picture through your camera, so if you do anything wrong, they know how to get you.
Yeah.
Sell all your.
So just so you know, we are broadcasting and we are recording. We're planning on posting these later so other superintendents and business administrators that don't have the opportunity to attend can watch. Sort of the thought process is that if they have comments or questions, that they could forward them along to you as their representatives to bring back. So when this is done, we'll post it up along with the materials that we sent out to all of you, so that others who want to review or be part of the process can. I don't know if everybody knows everyone else in here, and so can we just quickly go around the room and do quick introductions, and we'll go from there. So Jacob, do you want to start?
Jacob Wright, Governor's Office.
Ben Richmond with Legislative Fiscal Analyst.
John Lloyd of Senior School District.
Bruce Williams, I don't know who I am. I'm in Garfield now. I've been all over the place.
Ron Nelson with San Juan School District.
Sam Ray, North San Pete and hers.
Dale Lamborn Ridge School District.
Todd Hauber, Park City School District.
Scott Rogers, Tooele School District.
Natalie Grange, I'm the Assistant Superintendent of Financial Operations here.
Amy Barrett, I'm over the minimum school program. I'm the administrator.
You guys want to?
Von Horton, USBE from Financial Operations.
John Palmer, USBE, Financial Operations.
Brett Baltazar, USB Financial Operations.
Kieran McGinnis, USBE Financial Operations under Jamie Barrett, MSP.
So Kieran does a lot of she's been the one doing the NESS collections for the last few years. So she knows the NESS data quite well. Brett, John, and Vaughn are also, that kind of rhymes, Brett, John, and Vaughn. They're working on the UPES stuff, and then John will be working with Jamie with MSP. So we have some very kind of backgrounds of our staff here. Scott Jones, who's the Deputy Superintendent of Operations, will be here in probably a few minutes, or I think he said maybe 45 minutes. He's in another meeting right now, but he'll be coming down this time. So the intent of this work group, I think most of you probably know why we're here. During the legislative session, there were lots of conversations about NESS in particular. There was a legislative request that was supported by the State Board of Education, UASVO, and USBA, USSA, all those groups got together and made a legislative request for more funding for NESS. And one of the major questions that came up during the session is, why do we have carryover or fund balances in NESS that we're not distributing? We have some limitations with the way the funding formula is working. As when we came in and took over MSP about 2 to 3 years ago, 5 years ago, feels about like 10, we had some questions about the way the formula was working and the data points that went into it. And one of our charges from the board was to actually go through all the MSP formulas and make sure that we're doing what the statute says, make sure the board rule is consistent with what statute says, make sure our data points are solid, make sure we have good definitions, make sure we have good guiding principles so that our LEAs know what we're doing and why, and that the calculations are transparent. So all those things kind of coalesced into a question that I can't remember if the board or if the legislature instructed us to have this work group or if we just volunteered. I think it kind of started in the equity conversations a year or so ago. But we wanted to systematically go through the formula, go through the data, talk through some of the concerns and implementation issues that we have, get your perspective, get your suggestions, take some time to do some research so that we as a group can make a thoughtful recommendation to the legislature. Obviously, I think that we all fundamentally feel, know, and understand some of the limitations surrounding the necessarily existent small schools in our rural areas. We want to ensure that we don't cut funding. That's not our primary objective. Our objective is not to take money away from anybody or harm anyone in any way, especially as we're providing services for students. So we're trying to figure out a way that we can standardize the formula, work better with the data we have, make it more efficient for everybody, and create a platform where I think my driving principle, this is my personal opinion, but everyone that you talk to, there's a very compelling reason, and each LEA has a different concern or issue or problem or circumstance that they're trying to fit into within their area. They all have significant justification and narratives as to why these funds are so important, but we as a group don't have a good way to quantify that. Like, our data doesn't show that, and that makes it really difficult to make proposals to the legislature without quantifiable data or measures to show them. So
what kind of quantifiable data or measures are you looking for now?
Well, so one of the core issues that popped up last year, we have to report carryover to Jacob and Ben, and they put that before the committee, and for the past 2 or 3 years, we haven't been able to distribute the entire appropriation out in the current year, which seems silly. You all have needs. You all have programs you're trying to run, students you're trying to provide services for, but because of the way the formula is working and our inability to adjust the regression models, we can't distribute the funds based on the current constraints. We did a lot of research trying to figure out what went into generating those regression models, how do we tweak the numbers so that we can distribute it to you, and our statisticians cannot replicate those models. We have some data, and we want to talk through some of that and show you what we have, but we can't replicate what was created long before I got here, maybe before some of you were here. Again, we're not trying to fundamentally adjust what the point of NESS is, but we can't distribute the current year money, so in the legislature's eyes, they want to know why you're asking for more money when we're not even using all the money that we have. And it's not that there isn't a need, it's that the statute and the way the formula works ties our hands. A few years ago, I think it was, I don't remember, 2014 or something, 13, We came up with a formula to distribute the carryover. So if you look on your allotment memos this year, we're giving you current year NESS money, 2019 NESS money, and you're also probably getting a distribution from 18, right? When we get that loaded in. And that's so that we can get rid of the carryover, but it just seems silly that we have these two formulas to allocate funds when really the work or the problem that we're trying to solve is that the initial formula isn't really doing its job, right? We wouldn't need a secondary formula if the first formula was accurately representing the costs and the needs and the money that we're trying to distribute. And so that's really what we wanted to kind of talk through today. We want to approach this work group a little bit like we approached the transportation work group. That one went really well this year. We pulled a group together and we talked through some core principles. We talked about, we let everyone kind of reflect on their feelings and the things that were important to them. And by the second work group meeting, we had sort of coalesced to what the actual problem was that we were trying to solve and solved it, I think, within a reasonable amount of time. So we're hoping we could kind of take the same approach with this first meeting, that we could talk through how the formula works, just so everyone's familiar with it. I know sometimes when we throw those spreadsheets up, they get kind of scary and nobody really wants to dig through them. I hope you all had the opportunity to watch Jamie's video. Send her a rating on YouTube or something. Yep. We do have plans to make videos for all of the formulas like that so that anybody at any time can get in and understand what's going on. We wanted to talk through the applications that we're collecting and talk through some of the eligibility criteria and statute. We have some thoughts and feelings, and we want to feel or understand what, from the LEA perspective, your thoughts are on that. And then show you a little bit of some of the things that we found in other states if we have time, and kind of walk away from this meeting with a list of to-dos, if you will. Maybe things that you do, maybe things that we do, some research that we do, and then come back together at our next meeting. Before I forget, so we had our next meeting scheduled for the 18th, but it sounds like that's spring break time. Fall break, winter break, whatever it is. So we're in the
Southern Hemisphere.
Yeah,
You're right.
in the summer hemisphere. Everyone's going south. It's that time of year when everyone goes to St. George. So we're going to cancel that meeting on the 18th. We had another meeting scheduled on the 26th. We're just going to keep that one. So we won't reschedule anything right now. Let's have the meeting on the 26th, and then there's another one scheduled for the 12th of November. If we end up having to schedule another one because we can't make it in 3, we'll do that at that time and work with everyone's schedules. I think that might give us a little bit more time. We're also trying to do projections and budgets in the grant system, so we might need a little bit of time to do some research if that's the direction that comes out of the group. So does anyone want to add anything before we dive into the formula?
Our district gets a very small amount. I'm not here representing. I'm hearing from the superintendents that I've talked to is that the running fine, there's not a problem. The problem is the money, it's because there's a certain amount held back in reserve, and if they want to distribute it, just distribute it out. If you don't want, and if you do want to hold it back in reserve, distribute it out the same year with the secondary formula, and it's just fine. So they're saying, why do we need to change it? Is there an agenda? They're afraid of losing their money. Some of their schools we can't run without the money. So they're wondering why it's a crisis. I watched the video. It sounds like the money's distributed. If the problem is some of it's distributed this year and some of it's distributed next year for the previous year, there's a reason we just can't distribute that in the spring. Or is it really broken is what my superintendent is asking. So I don't know what to tell them, and I was hoping.
I think that's fair. I think those are the questions that we want to talk about today.
To that, I think it might be helpful for you both to go over the specific problems in the formula that you've talked about. In addition to that, we did a report to the Executive Appropriations Committee back in 2014. Bruce probably remembers this. And at the time, or I would say currently, there's no reporting mechanism to ensure that the money appropriated for necessarily existent small schools is actually going to the school. It qualifies for NESS. It goes to the district, but there's no proof that it's going on to the school. And then there was also the question of the balances at that point. We increase funding for NESS. It sits there for a half year or a year to become a balance and then distribute it. Kind of leads me to say that there's a real problem with the formula. that does need to be addressed. We can continue going on with a formula that doesn't really capture costs or differentials in size of school or stuff along that line. And it's also led me to have a question as, is it really measuring what we want it to do? Or is there another way we can do NESS to distribute the money in largely the same way, but in a less complicated manner? Or, actually turning it into a true add-on program where you have a qualifying school and each kid in that school gets a certain weight because they're in a NESS school. A program similar to that would be much easier to replicate down the road than what we have now, and hopefully they can get into some of the problems with the formula.
So could you summarize the concerns? I'm trying to get these down. Here's concern one, concern.
Well, I say number one, or the regression formulas don't properly allocate WPUs appropriated by the legislature. And because of that, it leaves a balance that requires a secondary formula to distribute. So those are the two core questions and issues. On top of that is, how are NESS funds being used, and how can we track and make sure that the schools qualifying for them actually are receiving those funds?
Can I say a couple of things, please? A couple of things that I've looked at, and we as small rural business administrators, recent business administrator conference, looked at a couple of these issues. One is, they brought up the concept of having money left over after the formula allocates the money is mainly dependent on the fact that the data points were set up in 2014. And there's been significant inflationary factors that have hit us since 2014. Now, I know that the value of the WPU has gone up, which affects that as well, but the reality is that's one of the issues that we're dealing with. So one of the things that we can do, and I know that we can potentially have this as an issue at the next meeting, how I perceive it is, I think the formula works, and the concept behind it makes sense. It's based on a regression curve, which basically starts out and says, you've got a minimum amount if you have up to 10 students that you're going to get as far as the WPU. And then as the student count goes up, the number of WPUs goes up, and then it comes back down and comes down to 0 at the point where you no longer qualify for necessarily existent small schools. The reality is, the larger the school, the less NESS funding you probably need at a certain point. So I think the concept of regression analysis and having a straight line curve is not going to work the same as having a regression curve where it comes up and then comes back down. You can shift the curve up and use all the money. That's not a problem. That's a fairly easy computation to do. And that may be the first thing that we want to look at and say, let's shift the curves, all the short curves up such that all the money is used. And then let's try and look at a couple of things. The first is, what is the actual expenditures for these NESS schools now? And can we validate that where the money is, based on the curves, if we were to shift them up, that it's valid, and that those schools are spending that much now. But there's a secondary issue that nobody, I don't think, has ever looked at, and I know it'd be hard to do, but the more important issue is need. What is needed by those NESS schools? We do a really good job in this state of equalizing money, but we don't look ever at adequacy. We just basically say whatever is available, we'll try and spread it out equitably. But we don't ever go back and say what is the adequacy in order to actually provide college and career readiness for these students in these NESS schools. Now, I've spent 25 years in this state in public education funding. been in a small school district, the Morgan School District, which has their schools consolidated. So they're a little bigger schools because they're consolidated and they're not they don't receive any NESS. I've spent time in more of a middle-sized school district like out in Tooele. I've spent my time in a very large district like Davis. And I've seen during the last 9 months where I've been in Garfield, I've seen a big difference when you have a school which is a high school with 60 kids, about the course offerings that those kids and the opportunities that those kids have versus kids in a 2,000 student high school. So I think that we need to look at various things. I don't think we throw this, basically where I'm coming from is, let's not just throw it out and start over. Let's look at it and see, before we decide that it's no good, let's look at it and see if there's ways we can adjust the formula so that such that it distributes all of the money, and then let's validate it, either through need or through actual expenditures that are happening at this point. We may need to look at a school and say, okay, if you have a school of 10 kids, what have you got to have as far as staffing to provide an adequate educational environment for those kids? Because we have those throughout our state. We have a high school of a certain number. What have you got to have as far as staffing and opportunities? And what are the costs that are necessary? Because we talk a lot about college and career readiness in the state, and I think that's a major thing for these kids in these small rural areas. So all I'm trying to say is there's a lot of issues that are out there, but I think we need to find a methodology to go through it. And my thought is, let's just move the curve up until it uses all the money out, and then let's try and validate it first before we throw it out.
So I think if it were as simple as that, we would have already done it. And that's kind of the point of this discussion, is if you want to just dive right into the curves, which I don't know if everyone wants to, but we were looking for a sheet that said, okay, costs have increased. So let's get the cost per school, because that's how this was initially calculated, right? A per pupil amount. Let's plug them into the thing and have the regression move. We can't find those sheets. That's the problem, is that
This would be the only formula that actually responds in that fashion.
Right.
And we don't ask that question of the WPU. We don't say, oh, what did the costs go? So let's go figure what the real value should be based on cost.
The curve can move up.
We did
inside our formula.
In our business administrators meeting, we did that, and it was
3 cells will make that curve jump up and distribute
right.
all
D-Miles knows how to just shift the curve up.
But
And then you start saying.
can I ask you a
That
question?
really just
So
is-
how do I explain to Ben why I shifted the curve? What does the data say?
The curve, that to me
Wasn't
No.
the problem
No.
was the money wasn't being distributed.
No, the
What-
problem is the formula is not reflecting the cost of the program.
Well, Ben, what you're saying though is that you've got to validate it. And that's where I'm going. Shift the curve up first, and then let's go validate it. Let's pick some schools that fit as close as we can to those points along the curve and say, what is it really costing? Now that we're doing, our accounting is done by school, we can pull that out a lot better than we could 5 years ago.
I agree.
There's no doubt about it. So let's pick some of those schools and then let's look at what the cost is. And you can look at it and say, okay, how much are they getting in NESS? How much are they getting in ADM? And you can, those are probably the things you've got to look at majorly. There's other programs as well, but we can do some validation. And then we also really need to look at and say, what does a school of that type need as far as staffing? Because many schools have one teacher in them. It's also the principal and doing a lot of other things as well. Is that adequate? Because I think that's the issue. Do we have enough funding there to show that those kids, when they're done with that school, they're going to be college and career ready, like we have in a 2,000 student high school or an elementary school of 600 or 700. More resources there, because that's what this is doing, is adding on resources for those kids to give them an equal opportunity.
It's an equity.
An equal opportunity, it is equity, for the same educational opportunities may not be done in the same manner. Some of it may be done online. Some of it may be done in different ways. And we have to be really creative when we're out in school. But at the same time, that's the validation, Ben, that I'm talking about, is try and show that those costs really are at a similar level. But if you don't shift the curve up, where do you go? You throw the whole formula out? I don't know. If you look at, shift that, or can you put that curve up there so I can see the whole thing, please? So what you're seeing there, and this is one of the many, which one are you looking at? That's the
First and second year secondary schools. It starts at a certain point, and you can see that, and then the cost goes up as the ADMs go up, and then the amount of NESS funding goes up as the number of ADMs in the school goes up to a certain point, and then as you get larger, it starts to drop off. If you have you could do a straight line, but it just wouldn't be. I don't think it'd be representative of the actual cost or what the cost or the needed expenditures would be. So that's our perspective as rural business administrators, is to say, let's start with the formula we have now, and then let's try and do some validation, but move the curve up and see where it fits. It doesn't fit. If it does, then you don't need to throw it away. If you find out that it and validate it, then Ben's right. It's something else needs to be put into place.
Speak to that, just a couple of points on equity and the regression formula working. Maybe even, I mean, obviously maybe the regression formula needs to move a little bit to distribute all. I don't have exact facts behind this, but just anecdotally, I have 4 high schools. One of them's alternative and it's really small, but I have 3 high schools in my district. 2 are NESS. One has, on average, right around 300 students, so it gets a significant amount of NESS funding. It's North Severe High School. I have South Severe High School that's a little bit bigger, has about 400 students. So it's still in the NESS range. It gets less,
right.
NESS generates less money. It's actually on the downside of the regression as it goes. It's diminishing returns. And I have Richfield High School that is pushing 800 students. It's not a NESS school. So in my own district, I'm able to use those NESS funds, and Ben's talking about the money getting to the school. Well, the money does go to the school. It goes directly in the form of staffing, FTE. I'm able to equalize within my own district because of NESS. If I didn't have NESS, North Severe, the students in Salina and North Severe and the students in South Severe would not be given the same opportunities as students in Richfield. At North Severe alone, I think I'm able to allocate 2.6 FTEs to that school, which is 21 classes they're able to offer. If NESS wasn't there, they wouldn't have. So it is an equity issue, and the regression formula works because if you look at the offerings across my 3 high schools, they're not exactly equal, but I would say they're close to being equitable. North Severe, South Severe, and Richfield, they're able to have fairly consistent offerings because of NESS. And they're all different sizes. So the regression model works, but if that NESS funding were to drop at all, then the equity, it would go away. Schools wouldn't have the ability to be on the same playing field as Richfield, my non-NESS school. They just have the numbers and the size to be able to function without it.
Bruce, you and Chad just both mentioned staffing issues, and that's what you're using your NESS money for. So is it a far reach to say for X amount of NESS students equals a FTE, and we put a cost with that FTE and we fund NESS that way?
Not only.
I understand it's not only, but in that FTE cost, if we could associate what it actually should be covering for a NESS school and include that in the average FTE cost or something, and then make a formula based on that, if it's an equity issue and filling in needs of NESS schools, Is there a simplified method that we could use based on an average state salary with some other?
What you're saying is what I do at a school level,
Right.
at a district
Right.
level, I allocate NESS out based on an average FTE cost.
Right.
Based on what the school generates for NESS. I think, looking at the overall picture, I think the formula works, and the way it's, whatever it's based on now, however they generated these original data points, which I think it was a fairly significant amount of time up with those data points. I think it is working, just based on the scenario that I like.
Well, it was working the first year, right?
It worked the first year.
This came out, but then these need to be updated now. Every year is the cost to run a NESS school continually to increase each year, right? With insurance and cost of your FT, I mean, everything that goes into running.
Well, even if you just
That
look
and
at the
expectations
increased cost of URS, I mean, the cost of having your employees in the retirement system has gone up every year, right? It's gone up every year. That hasn't been adjusted in yet. And I think that, like, so can I say this out loud? Because I've said this in every NESS work group meeting that we've had. We are not here to take away NESS money. Like, we are not trying to take away NESS money. We're trying to figure out a way that we can take data to the legislature every year and say, the costs in NESS schools have increased. They need more money to address the needs of their students. No one in the legislature understands this. Half of the people in our building don't understand this. Depending upon the day, I struggle with it sometimes. What I hoped is that I could open up the spreadsheet and say, okay, where do I plug in current year costs, right? I should be able to go to the AFR and APR submissions by school, show how much your costs have increased, and those costs would then change the regression formulas. They would move them up exactly like you said. But that trail wasn't left for us. We have asked our statisticians to try to replicate it. We've given them the data that was given in the work group in 2 years ago. We cannot replicate. I'm not saying that the method isn't valid. We're not saying that we disagree with the theory. We can't replicate it. And if I can't replicate it, then we can't do exactly what you're asking for. You're asking for your increased costs, whether those are teachers, facilities, transportation, all those things increase over time. Cost of living has gone up. We want to show that. We want to reflect those increased costs, have that be the shift or the reason that the formula or the regression analysis goes up, which then in theory should allocate more WPUs to all of your schools for NESS funding, right? That's what we tried to do initially, but the trail in the information that I have isn't sufficient for us to accomplish that feat. And that's one of the reasons that we started having this discussion. If it was as simple as me going into the spreadsheet, typing in balances or typing in a data collection and it changing, we wouldn't be here. I'm fairly certain we wouldn't be here. And that's the problem that we're trying to solve. We're not trying to say that NESS schools don't have value. We're not trying to say that your costs are different or not different than other LEAs. We're trying to figure out how to do this without having to gather data from you every year, because one of the things that we hoped that you guys would do before you came here would be to look at the applications. Statute says we have to gather applications. I don't know about you, but your staff has better things to do than fill out the same information for me every year. Fair? Like, nothing changes. So
Can I just add to that? I think there's another piece, and that is transparency and communication out to the public is really difficult right now under the current formula. And I'm thinking, okay, if there was a way to safeguard that money wasn't going to go down so that schools could continue to operate and we could capture and be more aligned, why would we not want a simpler program that we could then explain in a more reasonable way without having to have patrons that were statisticians? How NESS money was, there's a little bit of a cloak of, cloud of secrecy around that just because of we don't have that trail. And, I've been asked on several occasions by patrons, well, how is that determined? And, and I say, well, there's a formula, ask Lark, But it would be nice to be able to have a little bit more discussion with some folks that are interested in knowing not only how that's used. So I think there are ways to put some safeguards in and say, hey, look, this is protected. The amount of funding that is protected, and we know that it's not going to go down. That's just because we know our costs are going up. So how do we capture that? And how do we do that in a way that is simple, easy to explain?
Simple takes away equity in a lot of
You can't get into diving and changing formula without affecting people's funding.
Right.
There's going to be, you start messing with a formula, there's going to be winners and losers, period.
But there are, I don't know that I believe that. I think that you can say, it's like the discussion around equity or around equalization. Are there winners and losers, or is everybody winning because nobody lost money? It just was a redistribution. So I would argue that. But if we can do it simpler, a simpler fashion, and still provide the amount of funding and the equity, why would we not look at that? I understand they don't throw the baby out with the bathwater, but that doesn't mean we can't innovate and change either.
I don't have a problem with that, but at the same time, the way the curve is designed is that the more kids you have, the less NESS money you need. And if you were to do something like what Jamie was saying a minute ago, where you assign a certain FTE, you lose the curve. It's going to be a straight line, and it's going to be ascending straight line instead of a up and down. Because as you get more kids, if they're all NESS eligible and they get a certain FTE assigned to them, the bigger the school you are, the more NESS money you get, not the opposite. So I think that's something we're going to have to. So I'm concerned about losing the equity if we simplify too much.
Yeah.
Now, I'm not opposed to looking at something else. I'm just saying, do we want to spend all the time we need to in creating a new formula if this one works? We haven't even validated whether or not it works.
I'm trying to be a good school student. I think there's, just listening to the conversation so far, I think there's a fundamental question we have to answer, because I think there's misunderstanding what NESS was trying to do. We have been looking at it as though it's a distribution effort. There may have been some history as to how it became a distribution, but right now we're talking about distribution. The other is this designed to cover differential costs of a necessarily small school? Got to figure out what path we're going down, because if we think it's going to be tied to cost, we are revisiting this wholesale. If it's a more simple question of how do we distribute funds that are coming from the legislature, then that's a different conversation. It is frankly simple. Back in 2009, Love and I were put in charge of trying to figure out how to update the formula. We sat down and we updated the formula. We still had the conversation about what is the cost relationship, but we updated all of the regression and all the regression tables. We did that at that time to alleviate this. We did that. Pulled that off. When we pushed into the cost question, we went back to a study that Pat did to show how the costs were determined. Assuming that study still exists somewhere. So if we're trying to replicate something, if that's, we're going to go down the path of cost basis, we might as well go down the study and see what were the parameters, assumptions, and variables in the study and see if it's still workable today. That's the underlying analysis of how we have this particular shape of our curve. However, if we're just worried about getting the money out because we're being accused of not distributing the money, it is a very simple fix. I've done it. I've been there already. So the fundamental question is, what is the problem that we want to fix? Is it a cost related, or is it?
What did you do when you updated that? Shift the curve up? Is that basically what it did?
So we did two things. We shifted it up and spread it out.
Okay, so that was the one concern I had is shift the curve up, and the 2 points stay the same. Those that are the most needy would probably, which is those with the smallest schools, don't get any more because it's got the same starting point.
Right.
And that's an issue that I've already looked at when we.
So I'd suggest we might have to figure out, what is this fundamental question? Are we here to make a program more accurate to current costs and figure out how you can tag those costs into the future for formula? Or are we worried that we have $2 million that we don't distribute every year?
There's a secondary question to that. I know that USBA, USSA, and dollars for the upcoming year. We received $250,000 last year. I know there's support from a lot of rural legislators to add money to the formula, but there is an overlying question, and that is the question of things. I mean,
Who's it going to help?
Who's it going to help, and why are we putting $500,000 more into this? So that goes into that second issue of the need, and I think I've heard that from at least from some of the people here, and I'm pretty sure that I've also heard that same thing from the legislative fiscal analyst and some legislators, that same question. And so in this whole thing, I think we need to not only say, can we just distribute what we've got now, but secondly, have to look at it and say, is it meeting the need? And thirdly, is there more need? Mm-hmm. And that's the point that I started looking at with the concept of adequacy. We may have to get down and pick 5 or 6 data points along 2 or 3 of those curves and say, is a school that is this, that has this many students, what do they need as far as staffing and other costs in those schools in order to have an equitable opportunity for those students for college and career readiness to a student that's in a 2,000 student school that's here in the Wasatch Front, or could even be in a. So to me, that's the issue, is we've got to somehow be able to explain to the legislature why they're going to add some more money to this once we get there. And that's why I said, let's take the curve up, look at it, validate it. We may have to push the one end or the other to smooth it like you're talking about. I like that concept of smoothing a little bit, and then have the ability to validate that in order to have that equitable opportunity, we need X more dollars to shift the curve up farther, so that those districts with students that size need this X dollars. The other thing that's interesting is we did a little playing with this, and when you put 500,000 into the formula, it doesn't shift the curve very much. It's a very small amount, and so any given school along that curve with $500,000 doesn't get a huge amount of additional. I think we're looking at just over $2 million. So it's not. That's another thing to be able to understand is putting money in. How much of an adjustment would it make in total overall funding to various districts that have schools of. I'm going to shut up now. If you believe that, you're.
So, from my perspective, when we talked to Ben about some of the issues that we were having with the formula, I totally agree. I could go in here and manipulate numbers and we wouldn't be here. But I'm not going to sit in front of the legislature and tell them that I did that. Like for me, and you're right, I can go in and twinkle, I can go in and adjust the WPU factor. So as you notice, each one of these tables has a different WPU factor, right? And I think that the theory is that it costs more to run a secondary school, right? I don't disagree with that. But how do I decide that I shift? And one thing that I noted when I started working with these formulas is that in the past we have been shifting and moving the regressions, but we were only moving secondary. Or the year that I looked at it, we only moved secondary. And I said, well, what about the elementary schools? Don't they have needs too? Shouldn't we shift their curve? I don't have a reason to justify why I'm manipulating a number unless there is a formula or a data set that I can update that does a calculation for me. Does that make sense? I think that if I walked in here and I reduced, so if I walked in here and I took 1 to 2 year secondary and I went, I don't believe them, I'm going to take it down to 5. You all would be really mad at me because your funding would be cut, right? Or if I said, you know what, they're 100% right and I'm going to move this to 7.5, right? The elementary schools would be harmed. And so from my perspective and thinking about my staff, who are the ones that are going to be called and asked. The state auditor's office is looking at all of these calculations annually. They're going to ask us why or how or if we have changed. And if I don't have a directive in statute, if there's not a formula that I can point to and say, here are the data sets that I plug in and this is what it kicked out. There are formulas in statute that tell us how to calculate the basic rate, right? We don't sit back here and make it up and shake some dice. I'm not arguing that this is a bad idea or that the theory doesn't work. I don't have any guiding principles to tell me when I make an adjustment. If I need to distribute new money, do I add 0.5 here and one across a WPU across every single regression table? So we have some issues we need to discuss about the implementation, because while these may appear to you like they work because we are making them work. And so I have some problems that I need solved. Even if we stick with this formula, or when we stick with this formula, there are some fundamental issues that need to be resolved. And I don't feel like it's our responsibility isn't the right word. I don't feel like it is my sole discretion to figure out a way to make it work and then not tell anybody, right? I don't think that does anybody any good. So one of the things that we haven't talked about, and I'm just going to dive in because I kind of feel like we're spinning. We have regression tables that reflect an elementary school. We have regression tables that reflect a 1 to 2 year secondary, a 3-year secondary school, a 4-year secondary school, and a 6-year school. A good chunk of our NESS schools are K-12, K-8, or K-8. They don't fit into one of these plugs, right? So what have we done?
How many K-12 schools are there?
So I sent you the data.
There's at least.
So take a look at this right here. So if you look at column, where it's at, right, Karen? If you look at column, here's all the NESS schools that are currently eligible and being funded this year. So right now for Beaver, Minersville Elementary, they serve grades 1 through 8, but we're funding them off the K-6 elementary table. We have a 7 through 12 school. Those are fine. One of these made a comment about whether it fit or not, didn't it, Karen? There are schools that have consolidated.
Washington.
Dugway.
Watertown.
So Dugway Elementary and Dugway High School are a single school. They're K-12 school. But right now I artificially split your enrollment between an elementary and a 6-year secondary regression table. Why does that matter? It matters because I'm giving you 2 bases. And somebody who's actually a K-12 school might have different needs than your school. Does that make sense? Right. Over time, and I don't know why, I'm not making a value judgment, I'm stating the things that we've found. Over time, schools qualified for NESS and circumstances or situations changed in the community and they consolidated or moved or shuffled grades around. That's the LEA's perspective, right? That's not the right word I want. Decision. It's your discretion on how to best provide services to your students and families. This formula or this structure is not dynamic enough to allow me to reflect those changes. I don't know if costs at an actual real life K-12 school are different than costs at 2 separate schools. I would assume that if you have 2 separate buildings, it probably costs you more than if you have one. That's just me. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe those are paid off. But it feels to me like if you have a separated school, I should probably pay you for that. And if you don't have a separated school, I'm unsure if I'm targeting, and I'm just picking on Dugway because I know they consolidated like a year ago. There's a provision in statute that allows for LEAs to consolidate their schools and that we hold them harmless for 3 years. We are holding everyone harmless for eternity. If you have consolidated schools within the last 20 years, we are not changing the way that you were funded. And that's a hard thing for me to explain to auditors.
Your point is good. When you consolidate schools, you can have, such as the administrative, you may have instead of 2 one, and I know that happened in Tooele. They have 2 secretaries. House into a hole, who knows what it ends up. Custodial costs. There are costs associated with having multiple schools that may or may not be there if you have one. So I think it's to our advantage to have something in here which will allow for consolidation of schools, as opposed to, at this point, maybe a district may make a decision based on out of whether to consolidate schools or not. And I know that that's an issue that maybe some.
Well, right now in the data, so I'm just trying to tell you why your regression tables work and why when you look at them, you don't think that there's a problem. They're working because we're artificially going into our records and splitting these two schools. We're splitting, see how they have the same school number? We're splitting your enrollment. And I'm not saying that's illegal. I'm not saying it's any of those things. I'm saying I am manipulating data right now, today, to make this formula work. And that makes me very uncomfortable. I'm not saying we're altering your head counts. I'm not saying we're messing with your ADM, but I'm unsure if the statute allows me to do that. And what if another LEA wants me to do that? Are we going to say yes to some and no to others? I only know the 2 or 3 schools that have approached us since I've been here. I have no idea what the history is for some others. In the applications we sent you, and I don't know if we want to spend some time going through those, but the statute outlines 2 or 3 criteria. I need to pull it up so I can remember. So there's a transportation provision and there's a consolidation provision. And I don't know if you all read through the applications, but some people are pretty cut and dry. They fit the transportation provisions, like we're good to go. Others don't fit the transportation provision, but they have a lot of really good reasons why their school should still be considered NESS. And a lot of really good reasons, that enters the judgment realm of, well, what if I didn't think your reason was good? And one of the applications that was sent in indicated that they couldn't consolidate the schools any further because the school was the primary source of income for the town. Is that a reasonable explanation for me to qualify the school for an S? I don't know. Like, I get uncomfortable when it comes down to my judgment whether somebody should or shouldn't be. I believe that our eligibility criteria should be outlined specific enough that it doesn't matter who reviews the application, every single person in this room would come to the same decision. And I think what's happened in the past is that everybody has really good reasons for an S, and I'm not saying that people's reasons aren't good, and I'm not saying that having a school be a primary breadwinner of a town is not a good reason, but everyone is qualified because no one really dares say no to any NESS school, right? Because that's catastrophic. We've only had one added, I think, in the last few years, and generally people don't qualify for a NESS anymore because of their ADM, right? So the only schools that we have exited from the NESS program in the last few years is if their ADM gets too large.
They're no longer considered small.
So my question is, when the auditor's office sits in front of me and looks at this application that I have now collected and said, why did you approve these people? My answer is because they were eligible 10 years before I got here. Because if I don't approve them, they won't have services for students. I can't go through the criteria and statute and point to a reason why I qualified this school. And that makes me uncomfortable. So things that I think need to be changed in the statute so that I can sleep at night is to fix the eligibility criteria. If we don't think that some of those things are value added, I don't know that any of the explanations that are being provided are or are not reasonable. I would like something in statute that enables me to approve applications and not worry about it, that I feel like I'm in compliance with statute. And if you read through any of those applications, you know that there's a lot of people who, like, some people are including bus stops as part of their transportation calculation, others are not, depending upon how close they are, right? Like, some people are the time that students spend on a bus is so extreme that they automatically, I wouldn't even blink an eye, and other people are kind of right on the margin. So they add in bus stops. Are we okay with that? I mean, I think as a group, if we're okay with that, then we need to put some of those things either into a policy or into some kind of a board rule so that everybody can be okay with it and that everyone can play by the same rules or have the same guidelines so they know how to fill out the applications. I don't know if Karen has anything to add, but I know she probably got a lot of questions when we actually collected NESS applications this year. There's a provision in statute that says we're supposed to revalidate everyone every year. Well, does that mean I get an application from everybody? Does that mean I just look at ADM? Like, we do validate the ADM piece every year, but the reasoning and the eligibility criteria to me doesn't really feel like it's solid enough, or it feels like it needs to have better definition so that it's clear as to who should be eligible. That's my one concern. Do you have a question? Comment?
Yeah, I appreciate your comments. And some of what you're saying, though, does make the hair on the back of my neck stand up, because you said very vocally, we're not in here to take money away from people. But when you start talking about the subjective matters in the board rule, eliminating some of those subjective matters, money is going to get taken away from people. So that's a little bit of double talk. The way the board rule is there are subjective facts. So when an auditor sits down and asks, why did you approve this person? Subjective nature of the group, that they wanted to approve that person. There's not a real, I get where you're coming from, there's not a true way to audit something that's that subjective. But if we're talking about going from subjective to something different, there's a good chance money will get taken away from
So can I ask you a question? Do you think that the ADM size is a significant enough eligibility criteria to be solo?
Other states have separated their NESS funding into small schools and into isolated schools. So there's two separate pieces of funding criteria. So, I mean, that was another thing that we've been looking at is what other states have been doing, and is there a model that we could adopt?
Or learn from, or take pieces of?
I mean, ours has been small and remote, so to me, you'd have to fill.
I had our staff, and I don't think that it ever got pushed. I had them create a map so that you could see where all the NESS schools were located.
Because that's also been a concern of mine, is because it says the distance within the next district school, but I've always wondered, is there a closer out of district school that would kick that school out of necessarily existent small schools if you transferred the kids over to that school?
I think some of that's already going on.
Yeah,
Like, for
we may
example,
not, yeah.
For example, we've got, a school at elementary in our school.
Open enrollment kind of,
Yeah.
students in Vernon, the majority of students in Vernon go to Tintic School District and not to Tooele School District. And of course that actually helps them in a way on funding, They actually drive a bus into our county, allowed here, it wasn't in Idaho, but and pick up kids in Vernon and
We have the same thing with Animal. They go over for a second, they don't have an option. So there are things that are happening there. One point that I wanted to just, before you go off of the concept of the applications, I know that there's been frustration you've probably sensed or sensed from districts having to put the same thing in again every
Yes,
so years.
we agree.
And the
wanna
reality
read the
is,
same thing
there's
every year.
never been, that I know of, a NESS school other than getting too large that's ever gone off a NESS.
To my knowledge.
So
I agree.
it may be that, I know there's been one that's been added, I think that was down in Washington School District, if I recall. And so, the question is, do you just need to put in an application if you're applying for new status as NESS, as opposed to having everybody go through the same exercise multiple times? So you have an application to go, if you're going off's easy, because your ADM just gets too big. And
That's assuming that the only eligible requirement is ADM, right?
So
if you're,
if you shift
pretty
transportation.
much nothing else is going to change.
Yeah,
Because
that's not, your building
We're
is
not
what it is.
growing,
It's not.
we're not building new buildings.
You're either gonna consolidate or you're gonna grow. That's how you're gonna get kicked off the formula.
Well, so that you guys you're kind of proving my point, is what I wish we could all come to an agreement about is what needs to be changed in the statute,
I agree.
so that I don't have to answer that question.
Yeah.
I don't want to answer the question. I want to say, I did what you asked me. I received an application. They still fit within this size requirement.
I
They
totally
were
understand
approved
where
in the
you're
past. It wasn't my responsibility. If a new school comes in, I can say, here are the rules you have to play by, and we can all move on with our lives. Because believe it or not, I don't actually like emailing stuff and asking you guys to fill it out and send it back to me. Like, we have lots of stuff to do, and so do you. So I find no value in getting the same information from you over and over. I think it's a waste of your time and mine. And if it's not going to change anything, then why do I do it?
Exactly, that's exactly where it's going, is that maybe we need statutory change in that manner, so that there's no sense in us doing more work or you doing more work. It's not going to accomplish anything. Ben may disagree. Who knows? But to me, that makes a lot of sense because there are very few things in small districts like that. We don't generally grow much, we don't buy much, and we don't build a lot of buildings unless it's a replacement building. So there is some consolidation, and maybe that's something that has to be taken into account. Oh, but right now, because of the way the formula is set up, it may be inhibiting consolidation.
I guess I'm concerned
from a
that,
funding perspective.
okay, so part of the issue is we want to go to the legislature and justify why new funding is needed, costs, other things like that. So if there's concerns at the legislative area where legislators aren't understanding it, and we try the answer being, hey, we just upped the curve and spent all the money, is that satisfactorily going to answer their questions, or do we need to provide, in my mind, your audience is your kids, in your district as well, but your audience is also the lawmakers that so to assume that, hey, we don't want to throw the formula out, and I don't want to redo things that don't need to be redone, but can't just placate and say, hey, legislators, we got this, and we made this calculation, and we made it all work. We've got to be able to explain those.
That's the second step I talked about.
Yeah, the validation piece.
Then validate it, or go with something else.
Because that's what they're asking for, and in order to fund us more, Ben, in order to get more funding, they want to tie that to transparency and accountability, right?
What I would really prefer is that this question not be taken up as an individual budget request item, but it's actually handled through enrollment growth by the factors changing in your school are automatically forcing the WPUs up in the formula, and that's just covered at the beginning from enrollment growth, and you don't have to come back every year and ask for $500.
Wouldn't it be nice not to have to battle over 250,000 to have a formula that would actually pull 250 or 500,000 into the distribution instead of going to battle and having to lobby for it?
That's what we did for transportation, is we actually made a request, for those that don't know. So in the past, the only growth that transportation got was student growth. So they got like the 1.5%. And then if the value of the WPU increased, we increased transportation. But the feedback that we were getting is that's not covering costs, because the costs we were using to distribute are 2 years old. So the group got together and said, well, why don't we change the way we ask for money, or see if we can get something changed in statute. I think it got approved in the committee. So basically what we did is we put an analysis together to evaluate costs. And we brought those 2-year-old costs into current day, figured out what the deficit was, which is kind of what we're talking about here, right? And it's not changing the way we distribute. We're not changing the distribution formula at all. We're changing the way that we ask for money, so that we can, I still have distribution issues we need to solve, right? But if it's kind of back to Todd's question, we're talking a lot about cost recovery, but the mechanism that we have to demonstrate those things is a distribution formula, right? So if we're trying to represent costs, I think we might want to consider what we did with transportation and discuss changing the way that we ask for money, and then solve some of our distribution issues, so that fix the statute, fix the things in the statute that are kind of wonky, bring things up to date, indicate what it is we're going to value as costs. That was one. And so I will send this out to you. I didn't get with our IT group in enough time to send this all to you, but for this will be on a website. This is a Tableau. You can basically hover over and see what the schools are and what their ADM is. This is just a graphical representation of that spreadsheet we sent. But we mapped the schools and tried to figure out where they were. Some of these ones that are on top of each other, those are my schools that have the same address, right? So they're different lines on my spreadsheet, different schools, but you can see that they're the same.
I think, and I might be as unanalytical as anybody in here, but I've been saying small schools for a number of years. The crow's too much, gets his head cut off. Kind of what's happened to us. We've been talking NESS money. Got to increase NESS money. We got to increase NESS money. We got to increase NESS money. Legislature's now ready to, and I'm not saying chop our head off, but because of that. So to me, what we've got to do, and I've been saying this in meetings, is we got to quit whining. And I'm all for getting more NESS money, but big districts understand the regression formula. Certainly the public doesn't understand the regression formula. The legislature doesn't understand the regression formula. So if this group is going to do anything valued, in my opinion, what we've got to do is find some kind of a formula that connects the NESS money to whatever else increases are happening, whether that be the WPU or whatever, so that, and be able to justify that to the legislature that, okay, as WPU goes up, NESS schools are affected somewhat in a relationship to that, whatever that is. And maybe it's a direct relationship using the existing regression formula. I think your point, Chad, that certainly as you get bigger, the need goes down. So I think the can't be a straight line. It's got to be a regressive formula. But those things are tied together, and then Natalie's off the hook because when she goes in and how did you do it? Well, the NESS formula is tied to whether it be WPU or whatever, and as that goes up, the NESS money's affected, and then Ben's not under the gun every year. Why are those NESS guys asking for more money in addition to the increase on the WPU?
You know, sometimes legislators ask for it without your.
Well, then I think they ask for it because they want to help. Right. I mean, my perspective is every legislator or contact that I've gotten, it's not, you guys need to stop asking for money. It's, I know there's a need. How much do you need to fix it? And I would love to answer that question. I think those are the questions that Ben asked me, like where.
Have we done the study various places and say versus what the curve is, and are they above it? I mean, that's to me the fundamental question of what we're looking at is, are those curves really comparing those out?
So Bruce brought up a point that I think is something that we kind of paused on when we stopped this work group in its different format last year, is that this fiscal year is the first year that we have expenditures collected by school. Some LEAs already did it, some didn't. There was varying interpretations across the board. We made an effort to standardize what we thought would be an expenditure per school collection. So the sheet that I have up, and I'm just bringing this up to kind of walk you through my thought process. This is the analysis that was used, I believe, in 2011 when the formula was updated last time, right? The formula might have been updated in 14, but we used 11 data. And I'm going to guarantee you that if I had this data for these exact same schools today, that these costs would be a whole lot more than they are on the sheet, right? But questions that I asked myself as I looked at this, okay, expenditures per students. Is that function 1,000? Is that transportation? Is there capital costs in here? I don't know.
I don't know.
Those are the questions that I have is, you're right, I can go to my AFR system and pull up these numbers, but I have to tell my team what to pull. And I don't know what we used here. And so this is supposed to
Because you're
cover.
gonna have to have some function
That
2400
included
in
everything
there as well.
but capital and debt.
So my question for the group, and so I promise we've thought a lot. I spent more time on this formula than I think I probably spent on anything else in this building, except for maybe the grant system. So I thought about having bond pull data today, right? I'm pretty sure, I'm nearly 100% positive that if I pulled data for some of these schools, I would for sure get teacher salary, right? I would for sure get supplies and expenditures and things booked directly to the school. But what kind of guidelines am I going to give to our LEAs to ensure that the costs, the capital facilities costs for these schools are represented? Because if you look at the school operating independently, right, you've got transportation costs, you have capital costs, you have insurance costs, and I think all those things should be reflected into these expenditures per student. And I don't know how the study was put together. I don't know where the numbers came from, but I do know if we walk down this pathway in the very near future, in the next couple of weeks, I need to give my team a set of constraints or a set of criteria to pull so that we're looking at everybody the same. And I'm not entirely sure that just using the AFR and APR is going to get me there, because I don't know if capital costs are allocated out of the schools. Sometimes they are, sometimes they aren't.
But this is an M&O fund, so We should hold those in.
Right.
So it's nice to use it that way, but I don't think it was ever designed that way.
Vaughn looks like he is.
Yeah, you can't just exclude all of the capital funds anymore because there's so many districts that are using capital to pay operating costs that you should only exclude like the construction type costs. Because there's a whole ton of 2,600 maintenance of the schools that's being pushed to capital that is just the regular maintenance. Some people are paying for all of their custodians out of capital and different things like that. That's not really a capital expense, but the law allows it, so it's being pushed that way. We're gonna have to define a little more carefully than just maintenance or capital and different pieces like that, because it's not as clear as it used to be.
The reality is, on a cost per student basis, capital costs other than construction or debt service are more expensive per student. Building where you've got a building with, so that really is part of what NESS may be, depending on where we come down, maybe that's where we have to go, is to get that cost as well as just your operating types of costs as well, because they're just utilities.
So to kind of walk you through the things I hope to have prepared, but I don't know if I can get there until I have consensus or definition, is if we're going to pull cost per students for the NESS schools, what do we want to have pulled? What do we all agree NESS should pay for? Because that's not defined anywhere. And if we're going to continue on the cost discussion, I think we need to capture that.
Purchase services. Let's say you've got somebody doing.
That's hard to define.
It's just school
right?
lunch and community.
In my mind, the whole point of NESS is to cover the additional costs that it takes to run a small secluded school. So you're looking at it on the margin. So based on if I have 10 students, it costs me more per student than if I have 20 students. So it's just every additional dollar, every marginal dollar of revenue offsets the marginal cost. So,
but do you see my point? So I understand if we want a consistent amount to qualify everybody by, maybe we do exclude fixed costs, but I don't think that actually represents the cost of running a NESS school. Don't you have facilities costs. I actually feel fine about transportation being excluded because those routes are funded through a different formula.
You've already addressed that with the transportation.
Right. So I'm totally fine with transportation being excluded. My question to all of you is, do we know that actually happened in the past? I don't know if we do.
Can I address the transportation costs? There was a bill that ran this last year that talked about rural schools in poverty getting additional funds.
Senate Bill 232.
Yeah, and it started looking at a pretty broad swath, and it went down to 2 schools or 2 districts. We're not addressing all the needs for transportation of rural small schools in that bill. We're going to really look at the cost of rural small schools. We need to not only look at to from, we also need to look at the cost of activities. Because I'm sending buses all over the state of Utah, and it's required by the High School Activities Association. I don't have a choice.
Something like NESS and transportation go hand in hand. Try to separate that and not include transportation is hard for me to swallow.
So I think that leads us back to the question of what is NESS supposed to or intended to cover? Because the things that you just discussed regarding activities, my understanding is that the current statute is not meant to cover that.
I'm of the opinion that talking about is look at it, pull it. Ron was just suggesting maybe the function codes goes out. My guess is you're right that the numbers we get per student are going to be significantly higher because just wages and
wages
benefits.
and URS alone.
Yeah, and benefits have gone up very significantly. So have utility costs and so forth. look at where that is. And that's kind of where I was going at. And then you find schools, plot them on your curve and say, where are they, how are we coming out? Are we even coming close to covering with NESS and with the regular? The only challenge is you've got special ed and a few other things that are funding some other things in that school that you're going to have to take into account. They may be a Title I school, they may be, you have to exclude some programs, new functions, and we have to potentially exclude a few programs in order to valid. And what are we really trying to do? Is NESS supposed to be taking the regular WPU and giving an add-on to do just the regular school program? Yes. That's where we're going. So we would have to probably exclude all the federal programs and special. What about CTE? Do we exclude it or we include it?
Separate CTE funding formula. That's what my argument, or my thought would be on the transportation, is that I don't think you can have both. I don't think you can have a time and distance requirement under the transportation formula and it be included under NESS. Because then you open yourself up to having, say, you're double funding transportation.
So some of these numbers up here probably may be just looking at what we're proposing. I think some of it is get that definition of what are we trying to do.
Well, and that's the intent of this group, is what are we trying to do? Like, I know what I think. I think Vaughn has opinions, Jamie has opinions, Ben has opinions. What do you think? What is NESS intended to cover?
I think one thing, when you start so we start looking at functions and comparing costs, I think there can be a significant chance of some outliers, just based on the fact that
it's about 100% chance.
Well, 85%. Well, I'm saying there could be some really screwy stuff. 85% of our costs are salary. So if you're looking at an S school that doesn't have highly qualified teachers, their costs are going to be significantly less than another NESS school that has masters plus 30, doctorate type teachers, and that's going to might be really hard to pinpoint comparability.
Thank you for saying that, because I think that's one of the, as we had a conversation about personnel, one of I don't want to say arguments, but one of the narratives that I heard last year was the fact that it's really difficult to attract those highly qualified personnel to rural areas. So you could attract them if you had the funding to make your LEA enticable, right? But if you're just doing cost recovery, you're never going to get there.
Well, and that's the point I tried to make. Not just cost recovery. Maybe what is adequate to be able to same thing I was going earlier.
Well, I also want to be cognizant of the fact that I don't want to do an ROI return on all of these schools every year. I mean, that's not our objective either, is to go and to do some kind of business case for every school. That's not where we want to head either, but I get what you're saying.
Is there another function that's going to affect the current formula, as it is the secondary piece of the current formula, rewards districts that have a high taxing effort? In general, that means so you may have one district that has a lot of additional local funding on top of the regular ADM add-on for NESS, because that's another factor when we start doing the data. You may find some outliers that way because they have the ability to provide an adequate education for those kids rather than just what's. And so those outliers may be the place we look at.
So can I ask a question about, because I think I was here when that carryover formula for NESS was calculated, but I know I was not paying attention to it. I feel like I understand the theory and the data points behind the NESS formula, but the carryover formula is based on tax effort, and that's not NESS, right? That data point has, I don't want to say it has no correlation, but
it's a statutory requirement.
Because we came up with it and put it in the statute.
It was really back, I think it was when Bruce was here.
Yeah, I was here, Martell was.
And,
But it's in statute because we put it there.
Senator Stevenson was very particular on including ability to pay in every formula. And that's what was put in there basically to show whether you have an ability to pay or you have a higher tax base, then you shouldn't get as much money under this. But when you're looking at just the core NESS formula, really the only tax we should be looking at is the basic levy, and that's equalized statewide. And districts have been able to cover or mitigate some way their relative inequality there through their other taxing mechanisms. But when you look at it, the core, it should just be that mix of basic rate and state funding.
One thing that they can do is they decision to go out and fund your facilities through debt up. Money. So you actually have the ability, some way, to manipulate the formula.
That part of, that's just totally secondary. And I would hope under, if we were able to fix the core formula, that could probably just go away because there really wouldn't be a need for it.
Right. If you were able to distribute
100%.
with whatever we come down to.
What was the percentage of the carry? Isn't it?
I have like
Basically all the money that's
Insignificant,
been
I
added
have like
to the
over
formula last couple of years.
$700,000.
Undistributed carry?
Yes.
Well, it was.
Because we're not manipulating the regression.
A million something?
I think I have about $750,000.
Out of 31 million?
I'll double check.
It's not astronomical, but it's not everything. I mean, by the time we get done with the transportation formula, I have a list of LEA's costs, and the amount of money I have to give away to distribute doesn't meet the need, right? But I at least have something that shows that the need wasn't met.
Prorated.
Yes, I have to prorate it down, but I at least have an accurate representation, at least based on the guidelines that we have now, of what the need is and how much money. So if somebody calls me and says, what were the eligible costs that weren't paid, it will take me 2 seconds to give them an answer. And that's where I would really like to get with here, is whatever it is we decide that need is or those costs are, that shouldn't be something that requires like dice rolling and voodoo. Like we should be able to answer that question. It's not a complicated one. The thing we're lacking is those definitions, those guardrails of what is this supposed to cover, how do we pull those costs, and you were waving his arm back
there's
there.
A couple of other pieces. It's interesting that there's only one district in the state that doesn't have a voted leeway that isn't a NESS, completely NESS district. Because in certain districts, they have so much NESS funding that they don't need a voted leeway. They're already one of the highest cost per student or highest expenditure per student just because they generate so much NESS funding that they don't ever go to their taxpayers and ask for voted leeway. So that's one piece. The other one is on the transportation. But prior to 2010, there was a separate property tax levy to pay for your activity and field trips. And it was rolled into the board local levy. But as boards have been giving away salary compensation agreements, they've forgotten completely that we need to pay for those costs and giving it away as salary stuff. And they'll come back and say, well, we've got to fund that transportation piece when it was a part of their board local levy that was rolled in when they did the combination of it.
What year was that?
That was 2010, but it went into effect in 2012. It was passed in the 2010 session, but took effect in 2012.
The levy that was intended to fund the K-3 reading program was also part of that
Yes,
roll-up.
another one, yeah.
That's another discussion.
The other one that we need to look at is there should be some standard definition of what a school is versus pick and choose until I find one that gives me the most money. Because there's a lot of them that if you look at two schools in two different districts, they look exactly the same. One's a a 6-year secondary school. The other one has a 2-year middle school and a 4-year high school. just because they're forming, and they're in the same building, they're the same school, but they're two different schools just to generate more money. And that's not fair that another school district gets less money because they figured out how to game the system.
So,
And they're in the same building.
Yeah, they're in the same building.
I'm sorry, your name again?
Vaughn Horton.
I have one.
Writing you in his book.
I'm just trying to keep track of the basics of what's said here for the people I represent. The one point I'd like to bring up is just because there was a formula in 2010 based on property taxes for what your transportation costs were for activities, there isn't necessarily a, as the Utah High School Activities Association does new region and alignments every 2 years. And one time you got a region that you can get to in a reasonable amount of time, and the next region you're traveling the whole state. So what I'm saying is the transportation part of the NESS that should be looked at is the activity costs. I understand that the two from costs are addressed in the formula. I'm not sure how the activity costs are. I don't. Not. I'm just not sure that it's
not.
You got to clearly address, especially for this guy. He's got to drive more than anybody in the whole state.
In
It
fact,
seems like a problem between bring that up, Utah High School Athletics or Activities Association.
It's okay. It doesn't matter if you bring it up or not. They don't listen. So.
and the other piece is that there was $500,000 for a guarantee for those who levied large amounts of money from their transportation levy, and that would then benefit and had low assessed valuation so that they could recover some of those costs. And when they included that in the board local levy, the ability to identify those and compensate those who were really hurt by it, and face it, it was San Juan and Garfield were the two big winners out of that. When they went and did that, it got distributed to like 14 districts instead of 3 that were getting it before.
First, but San Juan is still a huge proponent.
San Juan still gets a big share of it. There's no question about it.
Guarantee, transportation guarantee.
Hasn't increased since I-
No, it's the same amount that it's always been, but the way that it's distributed got changed, and other districts started participating. And San Juan and Garfield, their shares of it went way down.
So while we're bringing up data points or problems to add to the list, we have a board rule that allows LEAs to send students to schools out of state, right? So for purposes of NESS, and this is the set aside or the holdout that you talked about. So we set aside $200,000 out of the NESS appropriation every year. We put that in a separate program that's still linked to the NESS appropriation. We use those funds to pay out-of-state tuition. So in some of our LEAs, they're right on the verge or right on the border, and so that it's cheaper for them to send their students across the state lines to a different school. Cheaper, safer, better programs. There's lots of different reasons, right? And there's a board rule that actually allows LEAs to get reimbursed for the excess of the out-of-state tuition over what they get for the WPU. We hear it.
Is that for any, there's no size limitations or
Nope,
whatever?
it's for anybody.
Okay, I just wanted
Just
to
have to
make
have
sure.
an agreement and send it here, and we look at it.
There's a board rule that outlines what you needed to do.
So the point that I wanted to bring up, though, is we also have a data rule, right? We have a board rule that allows for this to happen, and we pay those LEAs who have these out-of-state tuition costs. So if you think it through, the parents are still living in Utah. They're still paying property taxes to the district they live in. So the LEA is still collecting money for those students. We have a data rule that allows them to enroll those students in school and to claim the WPU for them, right? So these students who are going across the border to a different state are being reflected in our head counts and our ADM, right? And in some cases, because they live in really rural areas, they're also being reflected as NESS schools. So I have a few schools on our list, and I'm not going to point anyone out because I'm not trying to run anybody over. People are doing exactly what we've asked them to do, right? So I want to make that clear. Please write that down in your notebook, that people are doing exactly what the Board of Education asked them, to record data appropriately so that we can fund them, and to make the best use of for student time, reflect parent wishes, safety concerns. But right now, I have a couple of, I think I have two, where we're paying those schools as a NESS school for students that aren't even being educated in the state of Utah, because they have to have a school to report those membership hours in. Does that make sense? And when we figured that out, we took that into account and we added up the WPU and the NESS money that those LEAs receive, and we compared that against what their out-of-state tuition claim was. And I think one of the LEAs, we stopped paying the out-of-state because the money they receive for the student far exceeds what they were paying to send them across the border, right? I think we've addressed the issue that was created by those two rules. But we also have some people in NESS, right, who don't really have a school. And that's kind of the point that I'm trying to make, is that for consolidation or deconsolidation purposes, they made the choice that was best for the student, and that's what we should be doing. But our structure does not allow us, or our structure needs to be adjusted in such a way that our data is accurate, our funding is accurate, and those LEAs are being treated equitably and fair, along with the other LEAs who don't get this funding. And so that's actually a really minor and kind of little subset, but as we've started digging into some of these things and looking at the schools that are on top of each other, or the schools that are, you know, in some of the outlying areas, when we started paying tuition for them, we looked and went, wait a minute, well, why do they have a NESS school if they don't have any kids? Like, how does that work?
So are they being counted in a NESS school?
So you've created to count that student so that they can get the regular WPU.
Yep.
And then they become a NESS school, even though there's no students actually attending that school location because they're going across the border and getting educated.
So we feel like that's something that's happening in the formula. We've mitigated the overfunding issue by not paying them out-of-state tuition and NESS and the WPU. But we feel like the definition of a NESS school needs to be such that you actually have to have students in the school for us to count you, right? Like, that's a data quality issue. Well, it's a K-12
That's a
school.
non-existent.
It's a K-12 school.
But it would require.
But would those kids have gone to a NESS school? I guess that was my question.
They would have if they had chosen to stay
in the state of Utah.
But should the, I guess the secondary question is, should the more than what they're actually spending to send a kid out?
So it kind of goes back to the eligibility criteria again. Like, so part of the issue is a data issue, right? Like, we need to fix our data so it's not bringing these kids in. Fair? I mean, that's a problem in my own house that I have to own and fix. That will solve the being counted part, right? But that means I'm probably not going to pay that LEA for those kids anymore, and that's going to be a problem with them, right? Because we've done this for as long as I've been here. And so back to Chad's point, when we make adjustments, anytime we fix or adjust or change or modify or clarify or fix rules, oftentimes there are some people who there are some consequences or repercussions. And so we haven't made any adjustments yet because we want to make sure that when we do things, we do it all at once with
those adjustments
clear.
should be fairly small though too, because you only have like one or two other ones.
Fucking a handful.
It's a handful, it's not one or two.
I mean, per school, so that NESS, if you had the NESS school, you're not gonna be sending them much money, maybe 10.
Well, but they get the base.
That's what I'm saying, the base, whatever that is, I think that's.
So our standard is that we don't make major. Well, our standard is that we don't make adjustments without giving the LEA adequate notice and enough time to plan around it. And so I'm not just gonna change something and surprise somebody. We wanna. Huh?
So you're treating these kids as individual schools plus their WPU. But why aren't you just counting them in their local district school?
That is their local district school.
No, where they would have gone if they weren't going across the border.
It is their local district school.
Okay.
So the school in its entirety
and so it's qualifying for NESS itself.
qualifies for NESS itself because it's so small.
But
I'm then bringing them.
as if it's attending this school as opposed to this
So
school.
they're already getting the base. They would already, I mean, they're just
So you're
getting
not giving two
increased
bases, one here and one here.
for
Right.
ADM.
They get two bases because they're a K-12 school that we've divided between two regression formulas. So they get a base over here for secondary.
Yeah, that's another question.
Yes, that's a whole other problem, but still involved in the same thing. Is they get two bases because really they're one school, but we split them in two to make the regressions work. Does that make sense? Clear as dirt. Sorry.
So one of the things that you're really looking at is having we don't have enough definitions of NESS. If we're going to stay with where we're at now, we need a definition for a K-12, maybe other.
You mean like another regression or another, yes.
Right.
Some sort of funding
Something
mechanism.
something that
Something to fit
represents
in
that.
and create a regression formula for that if we feel like that's.
Just combine it. About one base.
No, but, I
We
think
do
we've
with
got to
the
come
A.
up with something so that you.
We have
whatever
K-8
that
schools
comes
too.
down to, we could-
6, 1, 2, 3, and then you'd have to figure something else
We
out.
think we need two,
At least
at
two
least
more.
two more.
At least 2 more.
Can we go back, because I felt like we were making a little progress on that one. Can we go back to what we think NESS is supposed to cover? Or maybe have the conversation of what the legislature thinks it covers and what the LEAs think it covers?
Can I
So
just
we
make
can
an
identify those.
observation? That, it sounds to me, and I'm relatively new in Utah, but it sounds like Todd was saying, we got to get over the fear of losing money, but we're trying to correct all the boo-boos from the past 20 years. I understand it all, but we got to get over the fear of losing money. And frankly, there's probably some of us that are afraid of losing money, rightfully so, because we shouldn't have that money in the first place because of the boo-boos or the inequities of the way that was happening. To me, the more you deal into that, the more it speaks to, at a certain point, do you clear the slate and rebuild? I get the point of, hey, if it's not broke, don't fix it, kind of a thing. But if we're really trying to fix all the different perspectives and that issues, is that what we're about, or is it about we're afraid of losing money? Because it sounds like it's not equitable as it is right now because it's all so I don't know if you can correct the past 20 years of. Anyway, I just, as an observation, that to me speaks to, gosh, we say it's working, but then we're bringing up a bunch of examples of how it's not working and not equitable. So is it really equitable?
The concept of having a school makes sense. Cost of a real small school per student, and then it trails off.
Right. I get that.
So I think that's the concern I have, is I don't want to throw out that concept. Where those curves end up is a different story to me. And I think the first place that we go, have Vaughn pull some data from those schools, and then we compare it with where the curves are now and say, do we have data that's, I know it's not going to match the curve exactly. That is not going to happen. You're going to have some of them that are clear up above. You might have a few that are under it because you can't, and it may be clearly just because the school district can't afford at that school level to run it or hasn't allocated resources that way.
Got to determine what eligibility. We can't pick the data points of what we think are current NESS schools because that's. We got to clear, whether it's clear the slate or just clear our minds. We got to figure out what those data points are. Then you can go through the exercise to figure out, hey, is their mathematical formula working? That's where we're going to get, whether that's too complicated to explain to someone who's not a mathematician, or do we got to figure out this definitional stuff. Go to the statute incentivizes the discontinuance of two types of behaviors. It doesn't incentivize a behavior. It wants to get rid of, hey, if you can consolidate a school, we want you to go consolidate a school. That's the first test. The second one has to do with your proximity. So you don't want two schools, districts building schools right close to each other. That's this formula, if you just read statute at face value, is designed to consolidate. And then let's talk about how to fund you. And then the school board has full authority to now figure out what all the rules of the game are. The only thing that the statute spells out are your 5 categories of school types. Outside of that, board has full authority to figure out. So most of the eligibility stuff we've been talking about has been, how do we apply the board rule? It's not that the statute has some effect in it. How does the board apply its rules? Rule in there in a way that accomplishes the two motivators of are you consolidating and are you building schools next to each other? That's I think we have grown it into something bigger than that vision, which is, hey, there are nationally existent small schools in and of themselves, regardless of these other tests. It's just, hey, I had to have a small school. Population needs to be served. That's not in NESS. Flip side is, that's a challenge. Have to go to the statute and various combinations of the statute. Well, that's where you have to ask the statutory question. Only 5. If you're not one of the 5, you're out of the game. Or was that just an artifact of a statute written years ago? Outside of that, we're really just in the board rule world. The miles thing is a board. The ADM thing is a board rule. Regression is not a board rule. How the formula is derived. By statute, you have to use a regression formula. The factors that you use in regression are totally up to the school board.
The statute only establishes the maximum size, which it's not even really clear that that's ADM, right? The regression formula establishes the following maximum size for funding. So it just has a count. It doesn't say whether it's head counts or ADM.
And then it has.
Yep, so schools
so
with
0
less
to
than
10 are
10
the same as
get
10,
10.
and then you go from there.
Have a regression table, and if you were getting NESS before July 1st of 2000, you still get it. I have no idea what schools those were.
That's our kicker. It's probably most of the schools that are in here now were in then.
Yep.
And so now whether you
That
liked
goes
how they
back to
qualified or didn't qualify, you get to keep them.
Yeah.
So I have some anomalies on there.
So number 7 says to avoid penalizing a school district financially for consolidating, the school district small schools additional weighted pupil units may be allowed to a school district each year not to exceed 2 years. It also says the additional weighted pupil units may not exceed the difference between what the school district receives for consolidated school and what the school district would have received for the small schools had the small schools not been consolidated. So we know there are LEAs who have consolidated their schools.
Yeah. But that reinforces the incentive, which is
Don't consolidate.
Consolidate
Just
where
don't
you
tell us.
can. Yeah.
I think one other point that's very important, if we make significant adjustments to the formula, it's not necessarily in some districts that are heavily dependent on necessarily existent small. Where some other districts that have 1 or 2 outlier, it's really, in effect, it's just it's a hiccup. Some of them, like our district, very significant. I think probably the same way. If shift a lot, it would have a great impact on what we could happen in the process. But that's one of the reasons that some of us are concerned with throwing the formula is going to shift. How it shifts it is a big issue for some of us because we may not operate if we shift it away from us or others.
We just can't do that. Yeah.
So that's the hard part of you, because on one side you want to say, let's fix the whole thing and fix it right. But on the other, you've got some political issues that we all know are there, that if you have a district that has a significant shift in funding, that's going away, their legislators are gonna be beating on Ben's door and other places trying to keep those things in place. So I think we have to play that tightrope.
That's why we're having this work group.
Yeah.
I mean, to mitigate some of those concerns and make sure stuff like that doesn't happen, that's the objective of this group.
Right.
Is to talk through.
I
out
just
what the
thought
need
that
is.
that side of the whole thing, as we talk about it, there is a political side of it and an operational side that we have to keep in. If we're talking major changes.
I'd like to just say, when I was a principal, I had a superintendent that said, "What do you think?" The reason these districts are panicked barely provide the services they have now to the students that they have economy of scale. You don't $1,000 here and there isn't world. When you're a tiny small district, they could be. So the point I'm trying to get to here is, if we actually look at all of the needs of the small schools instead of just what has been currently addressed, I think it would significantly limit any losers. Then we would really be looking at all of the needs of the schools, addressing all of their needs instead of addressing a few of their needs. And even if they lost in one area, they gain in another, and they wouldn't all in the total. So I'm suggesting that we don't just narrowly look at staffing and supplies, expand that out and look at the whole cost of running that really small school, including capital needs, including et cetera, so that we have a real fair picture, and that also limits the losers.
Stating that to some degree, I think that is right when you look at an adequacy analysis is, do we want to look at and say, let's find a school who has the necessary test scores that are equivalent to have, and then maybe you won't find one, but
But we're not set up to do equity of school outcomes.
I
That's
will,
not in
but
statute
that's
anywhere.
I understand where you're going, but
Right.
it's a really big issue. But that's the real crux of the matter is those students ought to have the same an equitable opportunity to be able to end up with similar outcomes to what students who have are in another school, at least within. So, I don't know, maybe I'm going way too far down the continuum, never get there, but that's always been a concern of mine. What we look at is what's available. We don't look at what's necessary to get the outcome that we choose to say we want. I hear that, and I've used the term 5 times at least today, and that's college and career ready. That's what the governor wants, that's what we keep saying we want. But are we really ever identifying what it takes to get those kids college and career? These kids are at a disadvantage to to all the kids that are in a school where there's all sorts of opportunities. They may have 50 different classes that they can sign up for.
Where NESS is part of the basic program and supported by the basic levy, do you see concerns with including costs that have traditionally not been included or having conversations? So like activities, in theory, activity transportation is not part of the basic calculations in any of the other areas. Do you think that's an issue? Would they have to be addressed separately? Trying to think through what legally the basic is supposed to support, and I think legally the basic can pay for buildings and the basic can pay for transportation, right? It can pay for all those things.
We just have extra pieces of money that.
I'm just
Yeah,
wondering if
that's-
they're
that's
being
not
challenged.
Foundation is
Yeah.
the WPUs are basically there to provide a basic education. although that's never been defined and never will be defined. And this is a component of that. So basically, I've been trying to find the original report on the creation of the minimum school program because I wanted to see how they set up NESS there. I should have looked at this
I have it upstairs, I think.
But the idea is that these schools do cost more. It's never really, I don't think even back at that time was fully developed of how much more these schools cost. It's just here is a factor for you that the state is applying and giving you to recognize that cost. Whether or not it fully funds your cost is a different question. And so on that, I would say transportation probably could be included if we back out the transportation reimbursement through that other program.
What about activities? What if to from was kept
Activities, I
separately?
say activities are extracurricular and not part of the basic program. That's what your voted and board levies are for. Right.
Sucked in.
Well, that's different. It's part of the education system. It's not part of the basic program.
It's not just activity transportation. Transportation in general in San Juan District costs a ton more than it does even for Sevier School District, which is way more rural than Tooele School District. Transportation is a part of the puzzle. It costs more to operate a small rural school than it does inside a city.
So that's why I say if we do that and then back out what you get from to and from, that will capture what additional revenues from other sources you're putting into to and from transportation that aren't covered by the formula. That would be your differential.
Take money from other NESS schools.
So,
Because that factor would be so much greater for San Juan than it is for others.
so NESS addresses schools with what, 300 or less students?
Yeah.
If
So
you're
it
looking at,
Depends on what grade band we're looking at.
So things that are missing in the statute and the rule,
If
we
you're
don't
not-
have a grade band for K-12, like a size for K-12 schools.
Yeah, but I would also argue on that point that the statement above, if you're encouraged to consolidate and create special 12, so you're no longer really in this world, you actually accomplish the purpose of the statute. Get consolidated into something bigger, so you don't have to be in school. Don't get there, then here's some money for you. So I think there's application to the statute is a challenge. We've worked some things out with people over time. Way off your topic.
the reason I brought that up is because if we're going to talk about what Bruce is saying, large Wasatch Front High School, we now run a small urban school that doesn't qualify for NESS at school level. Still have all the transportation costs, and we don't offer near the college and career ready in Wasatch Front. So going down that road, it isn't just schools of 100 kids at the secondary level.
Well, and while that would be great in a perfect, we're making this harder, not easier. Like, to get to full offering equity possible, but I've sat in meetings with, back in the day, McHale Weathers, guys that talk about all the languages that are being spoken in there, and, you know, non-compensation compensation for that. So you guys are gonna get mad at me because I'm arguing that, but when we start down that road, we're gonna open ourselves up as small schools for a discussion I'm not sure we want. If we start talking about cost per kid or unique problems, we ignore 26 languages being spoken in some of the schools in Salt Lake District. And guess where the most legislators are from, folks? So I think we need to, and I see Chad firing up, but we need to get something that works for us without creating ourselves bigger problems. Because we start those discussions and we'll lose more than we gain, because, you know, I think while our situations are very hard, I'm not sure I'd switch with Salt Lake all the languages and everything.
I go back to my original, keep it simple and distribute the money.
Yeah.
Ben said the original intent was, we know that necessarily existing small schools cost more. So here's a pot of money to use. The formula is set up to distribute that money. So tweak the formula as allowed by board rule and distribute the money. And
It kind of comes back to, well, what criteria do you use to distribute the money? And that's really where we're getting caught up. Because I think you could meet both the need of a regression formula, this is just kind of thinking here, but and a simple WPU factor by trying to identify a cost differential. So you do that maybe once, and you update it every 5-10 years, whatever. But then you actually apply a weight to each kid in that type of school. So if you have a necessary qualify for NESS, you have an elementary school that is between 1 and 20 ADMs, you get this many weights on your kid. And then, which is higher than the closer you get to 160. You're maintaining that function, but you're creating basically a table by which you're assigning WPUs, and as those change, they go through and look at the WPUs and basically what we do to the rest of the system and distribute it out. But that would significantly change how funding is distributed. Go that way. But as all formula changes I've seen, there's always been winners and losers. There's always going to be winners and losers. And in most cases when that happened is the legislature has created a fund to provide mitigation over a course of years to move to the new formula, if that's what everyone has agreed should be. So I don't see any of that being a problem.
Weights, yeah, you're changing weights over a count.
Yeah, so it's.
And so you could try and convert that to some type of weighting and just assume that you get the regression formulas the way they I guess should be, convert that into WPU weightings and be done.
So
Yeah, the challenge would be on the funding side from the legislature as those counts come in.
So in the first
Fill in the
year,
blank.
probably not. Because either they would have to.
you're never going to get growth in these
Say
areas.
the weightings cost us $4 or $5 million more, they're going to have to appropriate that money. I don't know it's going to necessarily be a big problem if it fixes the problems that moving forward, and then from there on, as WPUs change, that's just included in enrollment growth. So there are multiple ways of going about this. I guess it does come back to defining the schools.
Well, the question will come
getting
down
some
to
core data.
Can you forecast enrollment by schools? Right now, we barely get by at district level.
And we may have to include
now
something.
We're pushing down to the school level, saying, hey, if it's part of the WPU growth factors, you got to figure out how that school is going to look.
And I think,
Maybe you do it based on prior year.
But those schools aren't going to grow.
but
Well, that's the question. That's the
They
the
don't.
challenge. Is,
Your costs grow, your schools don't. It's sort of an inverse relationship.
Ben's opening statement, he said, the concern that money given to the LEA is getting to the schools. And I think the thing I would like to see there is trust in the fact that it goes to the LEA, and it's up to Chad, as he just explained what he does with his 3 schools.
It's getting to the schools because the schools cost more to operate. So
Do that, because I think
It is.
regardless of
we
accounting
take it
for
to
it,
the school level,
it's
we
helping
make it
those
hard
schools
for you
operate.
guys, we make it hard for Ben, but if we actually trust the LEAs to get it to the schools, we save you a lot of problem, we trust business administrators to make it happen, and Ben probably still has to answer some questions. Well, how do you know the LEA did it? Well, I don't, but for hell's sakes, trust the LEA to do their job.
And that's basically where it comes down, and it's basically legislators hearing from their school, not
Yeah.
their district. We're not getting this money, or they're not seeing it, they're just not seeing the full cost of that. And so, unless you do put a marker, and maybe in the new school level accounting, you can actually see some of that, or you pull NESS out as its own formula, its own reporting category. I don't know.
And to be fair, we as the Board of Education have never asked LEAs to make NESS funding a separate reporting category. So LEAs are doing exactly what they've been asked to do.
Right.
That's
And that's
never
what came out
been
at that
a
time.
that's never been a
A lot
thing
more
here.
could be on that, and we basically came up, there's no way, in
When
the way
you
we
said
report
it's
funds, that we can come through and say that this money is actually getting to the school. You just have to trust your locals that you're doing it. That was really coming mostly from Mel Brown at the time. He seemed to be some satisfied after he spoke with a couple of districts, but
One of the challenges we have, say, us, they have no idea how much their school generated.
How much it costs to run their school.
Well, not only that, but send money to us, it's not percent based on schools. It's an overall pot.
Yep.
And unless you do some drill down, even from a business administrator's perspective, you don't know how much came from.
Unless I send you the
Grass Creek versus-
spreadsheet, you don't have it.
That's right. And,
Agreed.
you know, like, for example, right now, I've got that exact issue going on. In fact, at our next board meeting, I've got to help the community understand that we're spending far more on their high school than their happen or whatever. And so it's part of it is a transparency issue that I don't think we'll ever get to be having it transparent enough that somebody can know that we're getting X dollars, and have to have somebody on the other side say, what are we actually spending? You have to. So I think that's one of the reasons you get those questions.
So do we want to take a quick 10-minute break? So, well, we have it scheduled till 5. I don't know if weather and
If we could get out of
Fortitude
town,
is
those of
below.
us going south, if we get out of town before 5 o'clock when things are really crazy.
You're not alone.
So one thing I wanted to point out before we break. So Jamie manages a
Give to him.
Jamie manages a federal program called Rural and Low Income Schools, which I think a good chunk of you are eligible for. There is a definition in that statute of rural schools. Do you have it? Can you read what it is?
No, the state has to come up with the
Oh,
definition.
we have a definition.
Mhm.
What is it?
Is this a new program?
No.
What again?
It's the REAP program, and within REAP, there's 2 federal programs that come off of that.
SRS.
There's
that one?
RLIS.
There's RLIS and SRSA.
Mhm.
Those are the 2 that come off of it. Rural and low income.
Small rural schools.
Small.
And then there's secure rural school money.
There's, yeah, but off
They're
the REAP,
different.
So REAP, and what was the other one?
it's small rurals. It's SRSA,
It's
small
and
rural.
RLIS.
School. I applied for that.
Schools.
We'll look it up. We'll look it up for you. I can't remember what it's called.
Can we look up what that SRSA exactly means? Basically, the state has defined that, for federal funds, that basically an LEA that's situated outside the Wasatch Front that stretches roughly from almost Brigham City in the north to Santaquin in the south, which Salt Lake is in between, is mostly the urban area of the state of Utah. Anything outside of that area, our state and the state board has defined as rural. So if we compare that to what the schools and LEAs are listed on the NESS, I think every school, every LEA
Everyone but
qualifies
Weaver.
as small.
So everybody, so these little X's that I was putting by everybody's name, basically everybody, including 2 more people, actually fall under that rural definition. So the only LEA who's currently getting funded under NESS that doesn't fall under that definition is Weber, and Weber has 1 school. Juab and Uinta would also fall under that definition, and they currently don't have any. They don't have any eligible NESS schools for whatever reason. They're outside of the ADM value.
What's the point here? Because I've applied for the SRSA.
Point is establishing a
So
criteria.
my point is, that's exactly my point, is we have 2 different criteria on board rural right now.
SRSA.
RLIS.
What does that do? What's it for? how do you apply for it? Is
Both
it-
of them are applied through the federal government. We don't do the application process here.
Right, I know
It's the items or the criteria that they ask for us is to find which ones are rural, and then they ask for a population density. So anything that's under 10 gets flagged in the formula. So you have to do the rural component, and then the small component is how they is measured by population density. I don't know if that's a factor.
So the reason we're bringing it up is we're trying to find something that's easier to define eligibility in addition to the ADM size. That wouldn't be transportation and whatever else people feel like is a good idea.
Something easier.
Yeah. Well, easier and easier to quantify. So we already have a board rule that kind of gets at the same thing, but it's a little more clear,
So are you
and
talking
no one would be
doing
kicked
that
out.
for NESS?
We're talking
That's
about.
So I understand where you have some fairly.
They qualify.
They qualify.
But that's what I'm saying, is if you use those same criteria for NESS, all of a sudden you'd have some very large schools that are.
No, this is the list. So everybody that would qualify under the current definition, it would add JUAB and Uinta,
But you would still have to
but
have
you'd still have the ADM criteria, and it
Yeah,
would
that-
drop off
okay.
Weaver.
Right, you still need.
Because you had talked about dropping the ADM criteria.
No. We're saying that instead of doing the
Basically saying that
transportation,
becomes
Instead
your-
of the
yeah,
transportation.
That becomes your
it's harder to
eligible.
quantify and
your
measure.
subjective and your,
Yes, we
you
get rid
still
of.
have the ADM.
What about the consolidations that go away?
Is it worth anything now? Are we applying it or using it in any way now?
But a lot of schools are.
But if you drop that off, do they all still qualify under the small and population
I think they
density
would fit
and?
on the
I see
various
what you're saying.
formulas. I mean, if
So
you
right now
consolidate it to
we-
one of those other schools, you
Right
chunk
now,
it
we
in.
have eligibility criteria that identifies schools. I think what we're trying to conceptualize and kind of go to the end and see if it would work is if we could qualify LEAs. And then bring schools in based on their size, which I don't think would change this list really. I really don't. Like, unless we have some of those like K-12 schools that we'd have to figure out how to manage those. I honestly don't think that it would change, with the exception of Weaver. And to be fair, you know, I want to be transparent that it would knock Weaver off because Weaver doesn't fall into that arena. But that would get, I think, at exactly what we're trying to do, because at the end of the day, at least when I listen to all the conversation, our argument about NESS, even though it's discussed in the concept of individual schools, really the struggles are an LEA, right? Just because one school is in a rural population, the same kinds of issues are at the LEA in totality. I mean, I would think that it's difficult for Garfield, whether you're at the Panguitch school or Loa isn't in your district. I can't remember what the one. Anyway, whichever, you know, you got the schools in Panguitch, which it might be easier to find people to teach in Panguitch schools, but finding a teacher in one of your schools that's far, far away, it's very difficult, right? But I would argue that you probably have difficulty getting high qualified instructors just in Panguitch in general. So what we're trying to kind of get out of the box and say, we believe that the argument is that we have rural areas. Within those areas, we have small schools, but we already knew that we were going to have small schools. They're in rural areas, right? So we're trying to, because one of the other questions, I know I said I wanted to take a break. One of the other questions that we've had that's on our list that I don't know if anyone has thought about, but we're also giving class size reduction money to these LEAs, which already have small class sizes. So we're asking you to reduce your classes further, right? I just see that, I don't know how those two things interact, but I think in our minds when we're distributing funds, we're looking at the NESS schools going, well, of course they're going to get class size, but.
That's not necessarily always true, though, that just because you're a NESS school, you have small class sizes. I mean, that
Correct,
goes back to a
correct.
district staffing formula.
Correct. Some of the smaller ones, though, right? Some of the small schools that have 10 kids, 20 kids,
It
like
might be true, but
those
it
are
might not always be true.
right. Those are the ones where I would argue that Grouse Creek and Big Water. I mean, you do not have 30 teachers in those buildings. You have one, maybe two. And so, as we've been doing some studying and looking at what other states do, a lot of other states have two formulas. They have a rural area, And then I have a specified formula for really extreme schools. Is that fair? And we haven't had enough time to dig through and actually see what they do. I think we found one other state that seems to have some kind of a formula or like a regression. Most of the others have broken them into two pots, and you get a pile of money if you're rural, and you get extra money if you have these really tiny, small Grouse Creek-like areas, and they kind of manage it that way instead of such a specified formula like we have.
So Natalie, one thing to bring up is the smaller your school, the less equal your distribution. At my NESS schools, I have the most differentiation in class sizes of all my schools. The larger the number grows, the more even they are by grade. But my smaller schools,
you could have no kindergartners for 3 years, right?
I could have twice as many kids in one grade in this school as I have in another.
And then the next year is a roller coaster.
Right.
You could have a family move in and have 6 new kids, right? I mean,
We hired a teacher that had 10 kids recently.
yeah.
I was going to add to what you said there, because in our district, we have Navajo Mountain, we have White. All three of those are qualified. But Navajo Mountain costs significantly more. It does even the Monument Valley and the Whitehorse. So I can see why the other states are looking at that remoteness, isolation.
Well, and from our
finding-
perspective, to address some of the questions or even some of the comments that you get from your constituents, if there's an expectation that when I publish this list that Wendover High School sees this exact amount of money in their budget, well, that's not how LEAs manage budgets, right? So we might be creating some of our own problems by having an allocation by school. In our perspective, we were trying to figure out, well, could we simplify this? Could we figure out a way to come up with a definition that works similarly to others so we don't harm people? We figure out how to hold harmless or do a mitigating thing, or figure out, kind of back to the discussion about what the costs were by student that would equate to what they're getting funded, right? Like, are there other ways we could think about this? We're not suggesting that we replace it with those. We want to take the time to thoughtfully consider a couple of different arenas, because then if the legislature asks us when we go talk about this work group, we can say, we did consider this and these are the 2 reasons that doesn't work. Or we did consider this and that was a terrible idea. We stopped in the middle. Or, hey, this is a really good idea. We think this might be better than what we have. At least we'll have a trail sufficient to justify or show that, yeah, we did thoughtfully consider 2 or 3 different things. We came back to what we had originally, or we scrapped that and went with something else. Like, I just want to be able to ensure that we do adequate work to justify to our constituents, to all the individuals that you're representing, that we took the time to actually thoughtfully consider this. And if we end up with the same thing that we have, that's great, but then we can justify why and kind of march that forward. And I think that will help everyone feel a little bit better about what kind of feels like a black box right now. So anyway, I just wanted to bring that up before we left. Are you guys okay if we take about a 10-minute break? 5-minute break? No one else needs a break? 5? Get some carpet sniffing glue out for a minute and come back. There's everyone online, we're taking a break, so there are restrooms down at the end of the hall by the elevators. There's like vending machines right next door. We'll be back at 3:19.
So then what do we say in your schools? Do you have 1 elementary?
Got 2 elementaries, one's just over 100, like 100.
Just looking up.
Yeah. You gonna try and relaunch it?
Yeah. There was an email. So it feels like a whole because in practice, I now would check.
It was 6, 7, 8, middle school.
Okay, and then there's
9 through 12.
Yeah, I was trying to see if there was some logic with this weighting here.
about half the size of
It seems like it goes by
I got 5
13.
elementary.
All ours qualified.
So what had happened?
Yeah, and then you've got some.
Way up now. Originally, one was well, the concept was, I think, that
We do the same in middle school. We got middle school outside of district and high school. So that everybody's got a school.
But they're
I've seen that.
That's another story.
Is that
But she apparently had.
So small.
how big is that town? I've been through Woodruff and through.
Lake jumps between those two, size-wise.
I went to go process, but two individuals.
It's like the original did something similar.
What's that? About the grants.
Anything you like.
I get carried to be, like, I have her listed as the approver in there. I don't want to have to be an approver. I'd rather just be carried. So
Say
I'm an
approve
approver,
everything,
she's
meaning
an
someone's
approver.
creating something and then
Yeah,
you're
so
having to go
like,
and approve it.
It's coming
So
to me to approve.
the program approver on that has been selected as you.
So that was.
Does the approver have to do that, or do I have to? The creator does. That's what I need to do. The program directors to list Carrie as the
Yes,
approver.
have Carrie, or have the program people just edit the pencil on the program approver and change it. All of your approvers should show up in that list. And they should be able to type in your name.
And I'm probably showing up as the default because I'm
Because you're
listed
are
as
you
the
the
main.
POC?
Yeah,
That's fine.
We play West Side.
Go in and change her, they can, you can edit and change it to any approver with those roles that you've allowed in there.
Thank you.
I just want to make sure. Now, in our middle school, we're on the southwest Wyoming.
It costs them more than just
Get show back.
See, say anything. Say they're
We discriminate against.
we play. In return, we don't just spend money.
Yeah, I want to read it, but yeah.
Holly Bell,
Every time I've been in that area, I've gone through Wyoming.
I'm trying to.
The other way around.
And have our
Looked at Patrick.
Issues.
You go around the bottom end.
So yes, thank you for saying do it. Do it.
So this has been my question.
Come around the bottom of the south side.
Well, that's another reason.
So what I'm interested in.
So basically,
I think that's where
working
it
on
came
that.
from.
Plus the cost of reference.
Amy, so how,
I would like my
It never gets updated.
Get on a contract.
And so you assume that are there years
Because we've contracted
The
with that
other
company.
Department of Ed programs
Not to say
are
that we still get a little criticism because we have multiple
Not
tribes.
doing
So that's how you get around.
IS.
Predominantly our
Because
tribe
the-
here,
the
G
big
tribe.
part of that. And there, that's rural.
It's my
And
employee.
what it is, rural programs.
province or whatever kind of do it in Night City versus other, they don't necessarily.
It's just when you're, this fiscal agent, it's funny, getting the money.
How are you doing?
Have to fit within the
Good.
county
Definitely are employees. I would have put, yeah, I would just, well, this I think starting here at 20,
Part of the actual agreement, we're just.
I may have started with high, come to a
Telling
center.
the school
and then
districts, and this is
gone.
like,
Yeah, so basically it goes like that. So these are weighted.
Good, how are you doing?
hey, North.
Steps down, it's just there.
I've been there
They
for
just send it to them and say, here's.
So almost inverting that, so it starts at 5340, 27.
Density, I have to know by year.
Waiting.
I'm okay with that.
Because in theory, 5 to 12.
I do have
How
this.
many work probably should have more.
Those kind of issues.
Trying to solve one problem. Maybe that steps down. You won't have any.
Well, we have the same.
We'll have a problem, but until you, what?
The very same issues you have. It's the very same
All
issue.
projections are already
I've
there.
got someone.
And we're off to a great start. We actually got snow on it. Way better than the last 2 years.
I
Who knows? But you're right.
We'll make them.
Careful what you ask.
Process it. So they don't get sideways. Sideways.
So the Navajo, San Juan County.
You have.
I don't know that I have.
Sites for I they were actually
Like I said,
And
we go with the flow. But this one Georgia just was like, okay, this is.
I didn't know
And
about
as soon as I had
Are you?
non-cooperative, it's like, okay, this this isn't working.
They have no students in the West.
We're all willing to
And do
make
you
it
think
work.
that'll happen quite a bit?
All their schools,
I
all their
am
students are right
certain,
here.
so the entities be aware.
UAB was actually SR, they were small rural schools,
Be able to provide better services.
I called up.
but it doesn't look like they submitted an application.
That's why it's on the road.
Okay.
What I'm doing is I'm just trying to summarize what each person
No,
says.
that's what I've been doing.
And then send it out so that they have something to go by, because I have people that are bad.
They have it already.
I understand.
Because we have all that. We can.
So in his mind, this was a
Get there and.
Well, I understand why she wants to change what she wants to change, but some of these districts, that's how they survive.
You're coming into, you came into prepared.
And they're barely providing an education.
You know, it'd be nice for you to have a mechanism that you can just go in and say, well, let's hire the service.
Demonstrate
We
that.
need these categories. And if you find that way, you can.
That is very welcome.
So we're saying everything.
So if you actually want to you've been there straight with us.
Smart enough to have a.
Arizona, we're not taking.
I'm sorry, I'm a little.
Not that fall down.
No, that's not. But that's it. But
You can't
it's
tell.
also a contrast issue.
Or I mean,
We don't.
I called Bruce when he was there.
So far, we're into
The legislature to
You're outside of that.
give Wendover into Nevada.
Which I don't want to say. I think they actually,
I think it was a
not out under a green flag, they're out
secondary and they provided all that.
You were the professor. They're out as dual
And Nevada said, hey, ours.
So I didn't take that on. I said, okay, great, Carl, great, I'll do a 1099.
No way. So Nevada said,
No,
well,
we're gonna fail it.
and then they wouldn't.
Our ask pushes into
We said, all right, I guess we have to build an element.
It's just rolled down. It's like I'm the one who's holding the bag now.
Yeah, four.
Because they each had to, you know what I'm saying? And then now, those parents on either side.
And I don't think you did. But it does have much to say. It's the same.
Do I have to accept and become the, you know, INS kind of, you know?
They're either you hire them. No question about it. Or you work for a company, you never pay
But you just
someone
submit it.
individually.
I would, they would come to us with it, because otherwise, address, we do
Provide the water, there is no system. But, sorry, you got my email. No, I'm trying to figure out what to do with this one.
But I'm telling you,
We got the situation.
the way West Wendover's
I hope we don't ever get audited.
Most of my-
That's why we do it. We would have to tell some of our children.
I'm more interested in this conversation than this. That's right, Todd.
I will get with
That's one of the main reasons.
I don't know that there is a fix.
We don't build Nevada and they don't build.
Some of our federal impact money.
Washington is, it's a definition that the board established for recruiters.
It's okay, we
Really, we're not.
figure out that 20.
They're a teacher in the state of Utah.
No, now there's like.
Not in the 70s.
But
So we're gonna
I don't know.
engaged.
High school, one high school.
And then it's in one county.
Small, like,
Rested roller.
I like this roller. Oh, yeah, the lemon custard warblers.
I was watching Anthony Bourdain's show. He went to a safari in Africa, and I was like, oh my gosh, they're everywhere.
That was when there was like 70. in 2 or 3
Why would they just notice the south side? Southbound traffic was standstill coming out.
I came out, I left my house at 5:45.
They do, oh, no, yeah.
We feel the same. You mean the parents? Yeah, but I don't think the parents will. I mean, they might, but if we were to build our
Ours
own.
is different. We got Cody into Vernon. Vernon gets the conflict there.
Stamping, but by the time I got
These kids wanted to go to Vernon.
I know.
But really, the reason they live in Spanish Mountain is because they want to be Moab. They're like, we're the last.
it wasn't too bad coming out this morning.
But we have to because there's no.
I don't know why that always jams up. There's just as many lanes as everywhere else.
So we'll see how
That's an option.
But I don't even know what.
I'm not mixing.
If they have 500 students, you do.
Well, so right now, so Britain's
But I think
Yeah, I was confused.
Joel, there'll be at least 2. Joel and Spencer driving. Like so there could be up to 5 now, though. So originally there was.
I was 7 to 8.
Well, yeah, so, right. So Mark, Britton, Joel, Spencer, Laura, and so it's a 7.
Yeah.
Right, so 2.
Yeah, exactly.
better gate.
So
There's a lot of
Laura,
pros to
and Terrell.
That's, they're putting, that's.
And then Reeby's running for the Senate, so she wins that. And No, she's not. So this is her board cycle. This is her, her board was she was at. Yes, at the point, yes. That's possible. So there's still a possibility. 6 speakers, you know.
1 minute warning. Ding, ding. Symphony do. Ding. I need a bell.
Camel.
Yeah, I do.
No, I don't want to get a bell. I'll stick with my bell. My artificial bell.
Steve Carlson sends me a text.
Oh, dude,
I think Natalie thinks you're me. I said, I don't think so. They're testing. She knows I'm better looking than you.
Oh, did it work?
Steve Carlson.
You know, Ron, back in the old days, you could come to these meetings and have a little soda and a little water. Things are a hell of a lot better than they are now.
You can't have water.
I know. Not that we ever had like steak and eggs.
What, Superintendent, what is your drink of choice?
I was thinking.
No, I'm just out of curiosity. What is your drink of choice?
Are we still recording?
What is your school-approved drink of choice? Your public building approved drink of choice.
Always there was a tub of stuff, you remember?
I bring my own.
Yeah. BYOB.
It's probably better. Well, it's obviously better this way. Certainly
Okay.
changed.
So I know we're still missing someone, 2 people, someone. I know that everybody wanted to kind of get out of here, especially with traffic and weather and stuff. So what we were just chatting about is trying to come up with some next steps so that we all kind of have some expectation for what the next meeting is, and it will give us an idea of what you want us to do between now and the next meeting. So a couple of things that I jotted down. So one, we would like to in the next meeting settle on some eligibility requirements or criteria. So if everyone could think about or ponder or consult with your constituents and come prepared to discuss eligibility requirements or criteria. With that being said, if you have any data requests or need anything from us to accomplish that, we'd be happy to do whatever we can to accommodate what you need. So we'll think about it. We'll ponder what's in statute and rule. If you haven't had a chance to look through the applications, I would suggest just grab a few. I think that you'll probably come to the same conclusion that we did, that all of them are good. All of them have good information in them, and not one of them is the same. right? And that's where it becomes very difficult to evaluate eligibility criteria. So ponder what you think reasonable eligibility criteria should be, and if you think we should change the rule or statute, and we'll talk through those things next time. And then the last thing, I think that we are actually making some really good progress, and I'd like to sort of continue that way if everyone feels the same, about what is NESS intended to cover. I would really like to have Vaughn and his group pull together some school level expenditures and bring them back for next time. So for the NESS schools that we have on the list, most of your LEAs have certified your data collections, and so probably in a week or two we could pull a few. But what we need to do is give Vaughn and his team some direction as to what it is they need to pull. Ben?
On that, do we have non-NESS schools that are of similar size? That might give us an indication of a cost differential.
Good one, I like that. So this is exactly how our transportation work group worked, is we kind of ruminated and then everyone shot out ideas and we looked for stuff. Yeah. No. So you're looking for non-NESS districts of the same size. Non-NESS district schools.
Non-NESS schools in the same district as NESS schools.
Okay.
However you kind of do that, so you have.
Otherwise your costs are going to be.
We'll pull district schools that fit into the NESS size, the NESS criteria, and then list them as non or yes NESS, no NESS.
And then get a cost and see where we're at.
Okay.
Say that 10 times fast. Yes, NESS, no NESS.
Yes NESS, no NESS.
NESS, no NESS.
Okay.
Yes.
So Bruce, what we talked about is trying to come up with a kind of a direction for what we want to cover next time, because I know everybody kind of wants to get out of here and get home at a decent time. What we talked about is everybody coming back next time with some discussion points for eligibility criteria, or consult with your constituents and other BAs and superintendents and see if they have feelings, and if you have recommendations for changes in the statute or rule, bring those back so we can. I would really like to settle on something next time if we could. The next thing was.
And you're talking district eligibility as well as school eligibility, right?
Yeah, so both. I think we want to evaluate both and decide if we still want both or only one or one or the other. I don't have any feelings either way. So, or something different. If you come up with a great idea, we like out of the box ideas here. The second part was what cost should NESS cover? And what I indicated is that I'd like Vaughn and the team to pull together some costs by school. We should be able to pull some data from the most recent fiscal year, from our school level submissions. So Ben suggested that we look at schools who are not currently receiving NESS that are of similar size from districts. Chad indicated he'd like to see some cost comparisons district wide. Where I'm kind of sitting is we need to help Vaughn, or give Vaughn a little guidance as to what it is you want to see when we're looking at cost comparisons. And I don't think we have to be fixed right now on what we think NESS should be. Maybe we should pull in a lot of data points and figure out, might help us make better decisions. So I don't know what we think we can pull in by school level, do you?
Well, I think we ought to pull it by function, show all of the information, then we can add or subtract different pieces. So
are you talking about show a total cost with it all in, start taking pieces out?
Yes.
Okay, so we all know that the 1,000, the instructional has got
to be there. I think all of the 2,000s except for maybe subtract out the transportation reimbursement out of the 2,700.
Okay, I got that. That makes sense.
And then all of the 2,000s there. And then I think that's probably about it.
Then we may also have to start looking at programs. So
Yes.
to subtract that as well, that it'd be in the 1,000.
Correct. Maybe a special ed or a CTE, because they both have add-on
Title I.
formulas.
Title II.
Yeah.
Title III maybe.
Class size reduction.
I don't know, because it's all different.
Are there any other data points or things you'd like us to look at, or data you wish you had to help in the discussion that you want us to pull together for you?
I would
Do you know if he'll be here next time?
He planned on it. I talked to him there, and he said he could be.
So should we plan some time for him to show us what he showed at the rural school?
That's exactly what I was thinking, is if Dee could do that, and then if we had Vaughn have some data points, we could easily, while we were here, pick 4 or 5 schools and see how close to the curve they come. Are they still above, is their cost per student still above the curve, which means that we wouldn't get enough money in NESS to fill that, but it's going to validate to some degree if the current formulas should stay in place or whether we need to go look at something else, in my mind.
I know we're all doing a better, at least in my district. I mean, there's still I still account for my costs at school level, but it's 999 costs get allocated.
In our school level reporting.
How well is each district doing with minimizing
District level expenditures?
We don't know yet.
We still have LEA certifying today.
So when we start looking school to school, we don't. Are we really capturing?
Are we?
Is it apples to an apples?
I guess what I'm wondering, are we there on school level reporting to know that the data we're looking at is even valid?
I think
probably more valid than what we had before.
I would agree. I don't think that it's perfect.
What about the administrative overhead costs and how are we going to deal with that? That's a real cost that still is a part of that school, and if you didn't have that school, you may not have as many overhead costs.
If you remember from the school level reporting discussions, we said that we would take a number that the total expenditures at the school location level, and we'd divide that by the number of students in that school. Then we would also take all the rest of the expenditures, divide them by the students in the school district, give you a school local amount, a district amount per student, and combine those two together for your school level.
So we would probably apply the same process or procedure that we're going to use for school level reporting to this discussion, because I think it would be beneficial to have consistent data moving forward. We might actually be able to see if school level will work, right? I mean, that'll be test number 1 to see if school level will work. So, okay.
And we might find some anomalies. When we did the previous look at the school level reporting, if you remember, we found a couple of things where there were just flat out errors in reporting that caused things to kind of stand out, like a 229% ELL student population at a particular school. It's just a flat out error in reporting the number of students, you know. So those kind of things will kind of jump out at us.
So Vaughn, does those numbers you're pulling include all the district allocations, like capital and?
How would
we? Also going to see some other anomalies. District like San Juan, they're going to have a higher, because they have more revenues, they're going
to do their revenue analysis.
Yeah.
I mean, I think, so to manage expectations, I think to think that we're going to have this comparison for every NESS school, there's not enough time for that. So we'll probably pick, we'll run the numbers that, as you indicated, looking at NESS size schools and see if we can find some 2 or 3 logical ones to look at in different districts. Is that okay with everybody? So I'd like to make sure we get 2 or 3 really good data sets rather than a bunch of ones that have a lot of problems and don't really help.
I don't think it's fair to compare a NESS-sized school on the Wasatch Front to one.
No, I mean in the same school, in the same district.
Like Park City High School is probably similar size to Richfield High, but their costs are going to be.
No, I'm talking a NESS, a non-NESS within the district.
Yeah, let's compare everything. Yeah.
Everything gets compared to Park City. Well,
just cut to the chase. That's all happening up on the hill anyway.
That's right. Because your salaries are so much higher, the cost per student is going to be up. We like that.
No, so we might not find comparable schools within a district. So we'll have to run some of those things and see what we can find. But I just want to manage expectations that we're not going to have enough time to do this for every school. The other thing, so we'll save some time for D, or we'll set aside some time for D at the beginning to go through his what he showed at the rural school.
I'll be glad to reach out to D.
Yeah.
I think you ought to set aside about minutes. Because I think what he'll probably go over, this is what we look at when we're down. Correct me if I got something wrong, but he basically showed how he felt like we could just allocate all the money through the current curves up. The other thing we had them do, and this is.
Will you have him bring not just the final result, but like show us how he did it?
Oh, yeah.
Like what he did.
That's what he
I have
did.
emails.
Okay.
He told us how he did it because he knew he wasn't going to be here.
Okay.
So we.
Okay. Can you send that to us? I don't think we're on it.
But I think that's something, and then the other thing I at least asked him to do, 700,000 to it, based on the legislative request from this year, just to see what it did to the curves and how much of it. Because one of the things that I think sometimes we do is a lot of money, but when you spread that out over all these schools, it doesn't go very far. It was a very small amount. And I think that's something to recognize so that the legislature, we can tell the legislature that as well. So those are the two things I'll ask him to look at.
Perfect.
And, so I'll get a hold of him.
Are there any, so should we just go around? Jacob, do you have anything else you want to address or talk about, or? Ben? You haven't talked enough? No, okay. Chad, do you have anything else?
Yeah, I'll just beat everybody to the punch on the eligibility criteria. First one that should be considered, should be heavily considered, is those that are qualified, stay qualified. You should grow out of it, or you consolidate out of it. And new ones would have to qualify under some kind of criteria. It's very rare that it happens.
That would eliminate the fact that we have to do.
You're basically discussing like a permanent hold harmless, like a grandfather for.
That would take statutory change, right?
It would.
Statutory or border rule.
Yeah, well, I'm still saying that, I mean, if you grow out of it, you're off. If you consolidate, you need to consolidate it too.
One other thing that I wanted to discuss, and we didn't even get close to getting there, is will you all take a look at the school size and see if you think that still looks reasonable? We haven't done any work on looking at those, but will you look at the sizes that are established in, the 80M size, and see what you think of that? Are they too high, too low, just right? We don't have any data on that.
You want to know what other categories would you recommend?
Sure, yeah.
K-12, we've talked about that. Yeah. What other ones should be in there if we're going to add?
Which one shouldn't?
Shouldn't. Yeah, maybe.
I think you got to balance the
if you're doing
statutory
an
language.
elementary, grades 1 through 6, and then just assume everything after that. Secondary, but then you have those bridge school, how many of those are we actually talking about? Or K-12,
Statutory hang up on that approach was contemplated. Consolidate and create a special. Yeah, that's what you did. Did it make you eligible for correction?
Some consolidations aren't. I mean, we didn't even consider, because we're still small enough when we consolidated at Dugway. More than 200 students. It didn't make sense to run two really small schools, just one necessary existing small school. So we didn't consider that. So it's not like all consolidation is not designed to throw you out. I realize that was embedded, but for us there were economies of scale that we save taxpayer dollars. We don't mind getting less NESS because of a consolidation, but we shouldn't be ruled out just because you consolidate. Just makes sense with keeping taxpayer dollars.
You have anything, Superintendent?
I'm good.
Oh.
Thanks for changing the schedule.
Oh, no problem. No problem. I don't want you here on UEA. I feel like feel like I might take the brunt of that, so.
But
Do you have anything else?
we made you work on Columbus Day.
I'd just like to hear a little bit more from Bruce, if we could.
Vaughn, do you have anything?
I had to say that, Bruce.
Anything from our friends in the back over here? No?
I'd like to know how Bruce is feeling about something.
Okay. All right, well, thank you for your time. I know that you have a lot of things to do, and we appreciate your time and attention, and we'll try to get stuff out. I'll send that, as soon as they publish the link to that map with stuff on it, the NESS map, I'll send that out. I don't know if it's helpful or useful, but it might be helpful in pondering. It's just a graphical representation of the spreadsheet Jamie sent, so.
So we don't meet on the 18th, but meet on the
Right.
next.
So we're not meeting on the 18th, in case you missed that memo. We canceled that meeting. We're going to meet on the 26th, I believe is the next time. I also believe it's in the afternoon, and I think it's in the same room. So, in the meantime, if you come up with questions or data requests, let us know.
No, I like your other answer.
That probably picked up, yeah.
It's like if we pull everything in,
I keep forgetting.
We need to discuss it.
I'm gonna get a lot of things, but not being
Get
smart.
what's going on.
Leads the
A lot
league.
of plans that everybody wants to talk to you about.
Psychological class? Oh, well, I was gonna say, it's easier to drink one of those because I like it a little bit more and open another one than it is
Ready to go like 10 minutes.
It's just way over the weekend.
What's that?
You're out, right?
I did.
Yeah.
Never seen one of those.
It's fun. Showed my wife in high school.
One time I was like,
Good. Were the leaves still on pretty much a month?
Yeah, they are. All the younger kids were out enforced. There was snow up there and the yellow was still there.
Good. Yeah, when the leaves are still on, it's this time of year, it's
so-
pretty. Isn't it?
Yeah. Well, they were pretty yellow and dark orange, so they won't be there for long.
lots of light stuff. Yeah, that's true.
Well, come up and see us sometime and stop in.
Will do.
See you.
My one daughter-in-law graduated from up there.
Who's that?
I saw you email me something. I haven't read it
I
yet.
would have known her as probably Sherilyn Rex. She was,
Oh, I know what it is. It's the one that got sent to the wrong place.
But the
Oh,
statute says
Steve
it's clear.
Yeah, Steve
Steve
Rex.
Rick's daughter.
Has nothing to do with it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so I was wondering, is that one of those programs you're just gonna transfer over to Human Services?
Yeah.
So I think
Where are they
the
living
discussion
now?
that we had is that we'd have.
they're out in Sandy.
We were just gonna write an MOU that said we're not doing this program here.
But yeah, Steve is actually out there in Sandy too. Moved from Lake
Well,
Tahoe.
the odd thing is it's
Was there for a while and then realized that 3 of his 4 kids lived in
directs
Sandy.
Well, I knew he had moved to Logan, but I didn't realize he had moved again. He was
He moved again just recently.
a Cedar at the